Welcome back, everyone. You're watching Bobcat Stories, the channel where real people share their real lives and we retell them in a way that hits a little deeper. Every story you hear here was sent in by someone just like you, from all across the country. We shape it, we give it a voice, and we bring it straight to you. So sit back, relax, and let's get into tonight's story. The porch light had just begun to glow against the fog when Clara Whitcomb noticed the shadow moving with her chair. It was not the ordinary shadow of spindle rails and tired knees, the one that stretched across the boards when the sun dropped behind Briar Ridge. This shadow had ears. One of them was ragged at the tip. It slipped forward when Clara rocked forward, stopped when she stopped, then drew back into the damp blue dusk as if ashamed of having been seen. Clara held her breath around the chipped yellow mug in her hands. The old rocker creaked beneath her. Down by the porch steps, half hidden behind brown hydrangea stems, a young bobcat crouched with her paws tucked under her narrow chest. Her coat was the color of smoke and fallen leaves. Her face was thin, her whiskers uneven, and her torn left ear gave her a lopsided look that might have seemed almost funny if her eyes had not been so watchful. Clara did not call to her. She had lived close enough to the woods to know better than to sweet-talk hunger as if it were a porch cat. Wild things came because weather had pressed them, pain had slowed them, or the world behind the trees had grown harder than the world beneath one porch. Still, when the rocker moved again, the bobcat shifted with it. Forward, back, forward, like a shadow that had chosen her. The evening smelled of wet cedar, cold stove ash, and the last lavender Clara had tied beneath the porch beam. Somewhere in the pasture, a loose gate latch tapped in the breeze. Thomas had promised to fix it 3 days before his heart failed in the bean row. Now she let it tap. Some sounds were all a house had left of a person. Clara was 72, silver-haired and narrow-shouldered, living alone in a fold of eastern Tennessee hills, where fog came up from the creek and rested on the garden like a patient animal. After Thomas was gone, the porch became the only room where grief did not feel trapped. His boots still waited under the mudroom bench. Out here, facing the dark trees, Clara could let silence be silence instead of absence. If the story found its way to someone's soft place, a quiet like or subscription would have felt like a hand on the porch rail, and Clara would have loved knowing where people were watching from and the name of the animal that once left a mark on their heart. The bobcat blinked, not slowly, not kindly, not like a house cat. It was a practical blink, quick and measuring, one golden eye narrowing before the other because of a pale scratch below her brow. She opened her mouth slightly to scent the air, drawing in the porch, the tea, and the old wool blanket across Clara's lap. Clara lowered her mug to the wobbly table beside her, the one her grandson Milo had once tried to carve into the shape of a rabbit. The bobcat's gaze snapped to the movement. Clara froze. The chair settled with a sigh. A drop of water fell from the porch roof into the empty geranium pot below, a tiny, hollow plink. "Evening," Clara whispered. She tucked her chin, ears angled sideways, tail tip giving one sharp little flick. She seemed offended by the greeting more than comforted by it. A dry leaf skated across the top step, and the bobcat lifted one paw so neatly that Clara almost smiled. Pride could be a thin animal's last warm coat. On the porch rail, one clothespin had been clipped there since summer. The bobcat stared at it with deep suspicion. Then she leaned close, sniffed it, sneezed once, and looked so insulted that Clara had to press her lips together. The rocker creaked again because Clara's knees ached. The bobcat flinched, but instead of bolting, she slid beneath the first stair, keeping the chair in view through the slats. When Clara rocked forward, the bobcat's head moved. When Clara rocked back, the head withdrew. Forward. Back. The house watched with its lit windows. The woods watched without light. Clara wondered whether the creature had lost something too. A den. A mother. A safe route through the ridge. Or perhaps that was human foolishness, the habit of pouring one's own ache into whatever came near enough to carry it. Thomas had always said her heart left the door cracked, even in winter. But she did not open the door. She reached slowly to the basket at her feet, where she kept mending and the old blue blanket she used when damp settled into her bones. The bobcat flattened it once. Clara stopped, waited, then drew out only a folded tea towel and placed it over her mud, as if this were any ordinary evening and not the evening when the woods had sent her a breathing shadow. A cricket began its thin song under the steps. The bobcat's ears pricked. Her whole body changed with the sound, hunger rising through her like a remembered command. She watched the gap between two boards, utterly still. Then the cricket fell silent, and she settled again, disappointed but dignified. Clara's stomach gave a small, embarrassing growl. "Well," Clara murmured, "that makes two of us." This time, the smile came easier. In the kitchen behind her, the screen door held the smell of cornbread wrapped for supper. Clara thought of fetching something, then thought better of it. Food changed things. Food invited closeness before trust had grown legs. She knew enough to know she knew very little. So she only rocked, slowly. The bobcat stayed. A car passed far down the road, tires whispering on damp pavement. And the animal vanished so quickly, Clara almost doubted she had been there. One moment, the torn ear caught the porch light. The next, the space under the stair held only fog. Clara told herself it was better that way. Wild was wild. The ridge had its own rules, older than porches, older than widows, older than any ache that made a person wish something would stay. After a while, Clara carried her mug inside and turned off the kitchen lamp. But before bed, she returned to the screen and looked once more toward the steps. At the edge of the porch, in the soft mud beside the empty geranium pot, were two small paw prints. They pointed toward the rocker. The porch light had just begun to glow against the fog when Clara Whitcomb noticed the shadow moving with her chair. It was not the ordinary shadow of spindle rails and tired knees, the one that stretched across the boards when the sun dropped behind Briar Ridge. This shadow had ears. One of them was ragged at the tip. It slipped forward when Clara rocked forward, stopped when she stopped, then drew back into the damp blue dusk, as if ashamed of having been seen. Clara held her breath around the chipped yellow mug in her hands. The old rocker creaked beneath her. Down by the porch steps, half hidden behind brown hydrangea stems, a young bobcat crouched with her paws tucked under her narrow chest. Her coat was the color of smoke and fallen leaves. Her face was thin, her whiskers uneven, and her torn left ear gave her a lopsided look that might have seemed almost funny if her eyes had not been so watchful. Clara did not call to her. She had lived close enough to the woods to know better than to sweet-talk hunger as if it were a porch cat. Wild things came because weather had pressed them, pain had slowed them, or the world behind the trees had grown harder than the world beneath one porch. Still, when the rocker moved again, the bobcat shifted with it. Forward, back, forward, like a shadow that had chosen her. The evening smelled of wet cedar, cold stove ash, and the last lavender Clara had tied beneath the porch beam. Somewhere in the pasture, a loose gate latch tapped in the breeze. Thomas had promised to fix it 3 days before his heart failed in the bean row. Now she let it tap. Some sounds were all a house had left of a person. Clara was 72, silver-haired and narrow-shouldered. living alone in a fold of eastern Tennessee hills, where fog came up from the creek and rested on the garden like a patient animal. After Thomas was gone, the porch became the only room where grief did not feel trapped. His boots still waited under the mudroom bench. Out here, facing the dark trees, Clara could let silence be silence instead of absence. If the story found its way to someone's soft place, a quiet like or subscription would have felt like a hand on the porch rail, and Clara would have loved knowing where people were watching from and the name of the animal that once left a mark on their heart. The bobcat blinked. Not slowly, not kindly, not like a house cat. It was a practical blink, quick and measuring. One golden eye narrowing before the other because of a pale scratch below her brow. She opened her mouth slightly to scent the air, drawing in the porch, the tea, and the old wool blanket across Clara's lap. Clara lowered her mug to the wobbly table beside her, the one her grandson Milo had once tried to carve into the shape of a rabbit. The bobcat's gaze snapped to the movement. Clara froze. Long before the bobcat learned the sound of Clara Whitcomb's rocking chair, the porch had belonged to ordinary things. It held a broom worn flat on one side, 2 clay pots that never grew anything but stubborn mint, and Thomas' coffee can of bent nails tucked beneath the window ledge. A faded cushion sat in the rocker, printed with little blue flowers that had gone gray from summers of sun and winters of damp. Near the rain barrel, Clara kept kindling under a piece of tin, because she hated starting a morning fire with wet wood. Her days had narrowed after Thomas died, but they had not stopped. At 5:30, she woke without an alarm, because 46 years of farm mornings had trained her bones better than any clock. She tied her white hair low at the back of her neck, slipped into the same brown cardigan, and stood at the kitchen sink while water boiled. The window above the sink looked toward Briar Ridge, where hickory, pine, and oak leaned together like old neighbors. Clara always drank her first tea from the chipped yellow mug, because Thomas had given it to her after their first winter in the house. He had dropped it once, while laughing at a rooster that chased the mailman, and the chip on the rim had stayed like a small missing tooth. She told herself it was foolish to keep choosing a broken thing. Then she chose it anyway. The house had sounds that kept her company. The stove ticked while it warmed. The refrigerator clicked. The loose gate latch knocked in the pasture wind. Sometimes the upstairs floor gave a sigh, as if Thomas had stepped from the bedroom and was about to ask whether she had seen his pocket knife. She never answered those sounds aloud. Not usually. Outside, the hills carried their own routine. Crows gathered near the cow fence at first light. Squirrels fussed in the walnut tree. A red-tailed hawk circled the hayfield with such clean patience that Clara sometimes stopped sweeping just to watch it think. The wild world did not ask her permission to go on, and in a strange way that had saved her. The ridge greened in April. The creek thinned in August. Acorns struck the roof in October like small, impatient knocks. Loss had not made the seasons gentler, but it had made them honest. Clara had once been a librarian at the county branch in Laurel Bend, 3 mornings a week and every other Saturday. Children remembered her for the way she stamped due dates, as if exe hat book deserved a ceremony. Milo, her daughter's boy, had loved field guides, especially ones they kept hot paw prints in the back. He would set crackers along the windowsill and tell her he was conducting research on local snack thieves. Usually, the evidence was crumbs and one satisfied mouse. Milo was 16 now, tall and quiet, with Thomas' habit of listening before speaking. He came after school on Thursdays to split kindling, carry feed, and pretend he did not notice when Clara packed too many biscuits into a cloth bag for him to take home. He called her Gran, never Grandma, because when he was 4 he had declared Grandma too fancy for a woman who could fix a fence with baling wire. Clara had laughed for a full minute over that. She had not laughed that long in a while. Her daughter Rachel lived 20 miles away, close enough to worry, and far enough to let Clara remain stubborn. Rachel called every evening at 7 unless her nursing shift ran late. Their conversations were practical. Weather, groceries, the ache in Clara S. left knee, Milo S. school. But beneath every word lived the question Rachel never pushed too hard. Are you lonely? Clara S. answer changed depending on the room. In the kitchen, yes. In the bedroom, more than yes. On the porch, with the hills breathing fog and the rocker easing her weight back and forth, loneliness became something she could sit beside instead of drown in. Out there, she mended quilt squares, shelled beans, cleaned garden dirt from under her nails with Thomas' old pocket knife, and listened to the edge of the woods. She had always noticed animals. Not in the way people noticed them for pictures or stories, but in the way a person noticed neighbors who preferred not to be greeted. She knew the raccoon with the pale tail that washed acorns in the bird bath. She knew the doe that limped slightly after a hard winter. She knew the young fox that carried stolen pears from her fallen fruit basket, looking offended whenever she caught him. She did not feed the wild ones, not truly. A fallen pear was a fallen pear. A bird bath was a bird bath. Clara believed kindness had to keep its hands clean when the woods were involved. Thomas had taught her that, though he was worse than she was, about tossing apple cores toward the tree line and pretending gravity made the decision. Still, the week before the foggy evening, with the paw prints, Clara had begun noticing small changes around the yard. The crows scolded from the walnut tree with sharp complaints. The squirrels vanished whenever the wind came from the north slope. Near the woodpile, something had left fine scratches in the mud, narrow and precise, not like the clumsy drag of a dog. A shallow hollow had appeared behind the stacked oak, lined with crushed leaves and one strip of dried grass. Clara saw it while carrying kindling and stood very still. The air smelled of sap, damp bark, and the iron chill that came before a mountain rain. Somewhere beyond the pasture, a jay screamed once and stopped. Clara's hand tightened on the wood until a splinter pressed into her palm. She did not know ove kep yet what had made the hollow. But she felt, in the quiet place beneath her ribs, that something had chosen the edge of her life because it had run out of safer edges. That night, after Rachel called, and Milo sent a photograph of a lopsided biscuit he claimed looked like Tennessee, Clara sat in the rocker with the blue blanket over her knees. She hummed a hymn under her breath, forgetting half the words and keeping the tune. The chair answered with its familiar creak. Forward. Back. Forward. At the bottom of the steps, just beyond the porch light, the fog gathered around the hydrangeas. Clara watched it for a long time. Then, near the woodpile, 2 golden eyes opened and closed. The morning Clara found the bobcat clearly. The rain had stopped, but had not gone anywhere. It clung to the porch rail in silver beads, darkened the split oak logs beside the shed, and made the yard smell of wet leaves and cold earth. Fog crouched low in the pasture, turning the fence posts into gray stumps that seemed to float without ground beneath them. Clara stepped outside, ve kepite, had her coat buttoned wrong, one bootlace dragging, and the chipped yellow mug steaming in her hand. She had meant only to bring in kindling before the clouds gathered again. The loose gate latch tapped twice in the distance. At the woodpile, something shifted. Clara stopped with one hand on the porch post. For a moment, she saw nothing but stacked oak, black gaps, and the pale underside of a curled leaf stuck to the mud. Then the shadows behind the logs arranged themselves into a face. Two golden eyes stared back at her. The bobcat was pressed into the shallow hollow behind the woodpile, so still she might have been carved from damp bark. Her coat matched everything around her: gray-brown leaves, wet wood, old grass. Only the eyes betrayed her. That, and the torn left ear standing unevenly above her head. Clara felt her breath catch. The animal was smaller than she had expected. Not a kitten, but not grown into the heavy confidence of an adult either. Her sides looked drawn in. Burrs clung to the fur along one shoulder. One whisker on the right side bent downward at a strange angle, making her face look stern and slightly puzzled at the same time. Clara did not step closer. The bobcat's pupils narrowed. Her ears slid sideways. She opened her mouth just enough to pull Clara's scent across the roof of it, then closed it again with what looked, to Clara, like grave disappointment. "Well," Clara said softly, "mort suppose mot don't smell like rabbit." The bobcat did not appreciate the joke. She gave a low, breathy sound, not quite a growl, not quite a warning, but enough to set the hairs along Clara's arms, standing under her sleeves. Clara lifted Beote's hat hand slowly, mug and all, as if surrendering to a tiny queen of the woodpile. A drop of tea slipped over the chipped rim and landed on her boot. The bobcat watched it fall. Then, with great caution, she extended one paw from the hollow and touched the wet mud where the tea had splashed. She sniffed her toes, shook the paw once with disgust, and tucked it back beneath her chest. Despite herself, Clara smiled. It was the smallest foolish thing, that offended little paw shake, but it eased the fear in her just enough to let her think. This was no porch cat wandering in from a neighbor's barn. This was a wild animal, hungry and cornered by circumstance, resting where the stacked oak blocked wind from the ridge. If Clara moved too quickly, the bobcat might bolt into the road or hurt herself trying to climb. So Clara lowered herself onto the top step, slowly enough that her knees had time to complain. The bobcat lowered her head. Clara waited. The rain began again as a thin whisper through the trees. It tapped the tin over the kindling, ticked against the empty geranium pot, and softened the world until the space between woman and animal seemed held inside one careful breath. Clara thought of Thomas then, not sharply, but with the quiet ache that came when she met a problem he would have known how to stand beside. He had never rushed frightened creatures, not calves tangled in briars, not fledglings fallen beneath the porch eaves, not Clara herself on the day the doctor spoke too gently. Thomas had believed panic was a fire that needed no more kindling. Steady, he would have said. So Clara was steady. She set her mug beside her on the step. The bobcat's eyes followed it. Clara removed her hand and folded both palms in her lap. For several minutes, neither of them moved. A chickadee hopped along the porch rail, saw the bobcat, and reconsidered its whole morning. It vanished into the wet lilac bush with a frantic flutter. The bobcat's ears flicked forward, then backward again, as if she had filed the bird away for later judgment. Clara noticed how every sound entered the animal's body. Rain, latch, Clara's breath, a walnut dropping somewhere near the shed. Nothing passed unnoticed. At last, Clara eased herself up from the step. The bobcat stiffened. "Mort met not coming nearer," Clara whispered. "You can keep your woodpile." She backed away one slow step, then another. Her bootlace caught under her heel and nearly sent her sideways into the mint pot. She grabbed the porch rail, cheeks warming, though no one was there to see but the bobcat, who looked deeply unimpressed by human balance. "Not a word," Clara murmured. The bobcat blinked once. That was their first agreement. Inside the kitchen, Clara stood ve capite hot, her back to the door, and pressed a hand over her heart until it stopped knocking so hard. Rain traced the window glass. Beyond it, the woodpile seemed ordinary again, just oak and shadow and weather. But Clara knew now there was a life folded behind it, listening. She phoned Dr. Lila Marsh before she could talk herself out of it. Lila worked ve kep ite hat injured wildlife through the county network and had known Clara since Milo brought a shoebox of baby rabbits to the library when he was 7. She listened without laughing, asked careful questions, and told Clara what Clara already knew in her bones. Keep distance. Keep dogs and people away. Do not try to touch her. Do not feed carelessly. Watch whether she could move, and call again if she seemed weaker. She may only be sheltering, Lila said. Let her decide what the yard means. Clara looked through the glass. The bobcat had crept out just enough for her torn ear to show beyond the logs. She was watching the porch. She's already decided something, Clara said quietly. After the call, Clara tied her dragging bootlace properly, wrapped the blue blanket around her shoulders, and returned to the rocker without bringing food, without calling, without asking the wild thing to be anything but alive. When the chair creaked, the torn ear twitched. Clara rocked once. Behind the woodpile, the golden eyes stayed open. Clara began with distance, because distance was the only kindness she trusted. The next morning, after speaking with Dr. Lila Marsh again, she carried a blue enamel bowl onto the porch and placed it 3 feet from the bottom step. The bowl had a white rim chipped in 2 places and had once held peaches on summer afternoons when Milo was small enough to believe peach juice counted as supper. Now it held only water, clean and cold from the kitchen tap. Clara did not look toward the woodpile when she set it down. That was harder than it sounded. Every part of her wanted to search for the torn ear, the uneven whisker, the golden eyes tucked between shadows. But staring could feel like a challenge to a wild creature, and Clara had spent a lifetime learning that care sometimes meant swallowing the very gesture a heart most wanted to make. So she placed the bowl, straightened slowly, and went back to the rocker. The porch boards were cold beneath her slippers. The morning smelled of damp ash, pine needles, and the faint sourness of apples fallen too long beneath the tree. Fog clung to the low field, but the ridge above it glowed with a thin band of pale sun. Clara folded the blue blanket over her knees and began humming the hymn with missing words. At first, nothing happened. The woodpile remained wood. The hydrangeas remained brown stems. The water in the bowl reflected a piece of gray sky and the bottom edge of Clara's porch roof. A crow called from the walnut tree, sharp and bossy, as if announcing that the whole arrangement was poorly planned. Clara almost answered it. Then the bobcat appeared, without seeming to cross any space at all. One moment the yard was empty. The next, she stood behind the last stack of oak, low to the ground, her body long and narrow, her torn ear angled toward the porch. She did not walk directly to the bowl. She made a half-circle first, pausing under the lilac, then beside the empty geranium pot, then near the mint that had conquered its cracked clay home. Her paws landed silently. but Clara could see where each one pressed into the soft mud. The bobcat sniffed the air with her mouth slightly open. She looked at Clara. She looked at the bowl. She looked at Clara again, as if accusing the old woman of inventing water. Clara kept rocking. Forward. Back. The chair creaked softly. The bobcat's tail tip flicked once. She came close enough to stretch her neck toward the bowl, then backed away so quickly that her hind paw landed in the mint pot. A stem snapped. The smell rose bright and clean into the cold air. The bobcat sprang sideways, offended by the plant, the bowl, the porch, and perhaps the entire morning. Clara lowered her face and pretended to study the blanket until the smile passed. "You picked the bossiest herb," she murmured. The bobcat crouched near the steps, ears flat for a moment. Then, because thirst was braver than pride, she crept back. This time she drank. Not for long. 3 quick laps. A pause. 2 more. Then she retreated beneath the hydrangeas and sat with her chest lifted, as if she had meant to do that all along. Clara did not praise her. Praise belonged to dogs and children learning piano. A bobcat needed no applause for surviving. But inside Clara S. chest, something unclenched. For the next several days, the ritual became careful as needlework. Clara rose before the sun, filled the blue enamel bowl, and placed it 3 feet from the door. She always wore the same brown cardigan and walked with the same slow steps, left foot on the porch board that groaned, right foot over the cracked seam, hand on the rail, bowl down, hand away. The bobcat learned the pattern quickly. She never came while Clara stood near the bowl. She waited until Clara sat in the rocker and settled the blanket over her knees. Sometimes she waited 10 minutes, sometimes nearly an hour. Once she did not come at all until Clara had gone inside. And when Clara looked later, the bowl had been nudged 6 inches to the left, as if the bobcat had objected to its placement. By the 4th morning, Clara began leaving the bowl exactly where it had been nudged. It seemed polite. Milo came that Thursday with his school backpack hanging from one shoulder and a paper bag of groceries Rachel had insisted Clara needed. He stepped onto the porch too quickly, and the bobcat vanished from behind the woodpile in a streak of brown-gray silence. Milo froze with one sneaker still in the air. Was that her? Clara nodded. "She's smaller than Mort thought," he whispered. "She heard you think that," Clara said. Milo looked genuinely worried. Should Mort apologize? Clara gave him a sideways glance, and for the first time in days, they laughed together. Quietly, but together. After that, Milo learned the porch rules. No sudden steps, no calling, no reaching, no trying to win a wild heart the way boys sometimes tried to win stray dogs, with sandwiches and hope. He sat beside Clara on the top step and ate a biscuit from a napkin, dropping exactly 1 crumb by accident and then staring at it with the solemn guilt of a church deacon. The bobcat, hidden under the lilac, watched the crumb for 13 full minutes. Then she ignored it. Milo whispered, "She has standards." Clara whispered back, "Higher than ours, apparently." Still, when Milo left, the bobcat emerged and sniffed the crumb with such suspicion that Clara had to turn her chair toward the pasture. A few evenings later, a hard wind came down Briar Ridge and rattled the loose gate latch until the sound seemed to travel through the bones of the house. Clara sat on the porch anyway, her hands tucked under the blue blanket, humming under her breath. The bobcat came closer than before. She did not drink at first. She sat beside the blue bowl, close enough that the porch light showed the pale scratch below her brow, and the burrs still tangled near her shoulder. Her torn ear twitched each time the rocker creaked. Clara felt the old longing rise in her, sudden and dangerous. She wanted to name the animal. She wanted to believe being chosen by a shadow meant the house was less empty. She wanted. In a way, she would not have confessed to Rachel, for something in this world to need her and not leave. But wild love, she reminded herself, could not be held just because a human heart had room. So she only rocked. Aaron turned. His son was pointing, her head not at the culvert, but at the ditch beyond. Then she sat back there, on her caught haunches, in the weeds, lay a scatter of gray-brown fur and two tiny paw prints filling with rain. Brisk. Aaron understood slowly. The bobcat had not simply crawled inside to escape water. She had been trying to follow the bank, perhaps after losing something in the storm. 3 feet from the door, the thought settled in him with a weight he did not want. The space between them. He lifted one hand toward Eli, and somehow, palm down. By not crossing it, Eli watched the hand, accepted its meaning, first time the bobcat slept on Clara's porch. Then he reached for his headphones and put them on, not for himself, for the fog to lift from the pasture, but because the wipers, hazard lights, and rain made too much noise for the animal too. The wet steps dried in patches, leaving dark half-moons where the shadows held on. He called the county dispatcher, keeping his voice low. Clara had carried out a basket of quilt pieces. The dispatcher connected him to a state wildlife officer named Mara Singh, who told him not to approach, not to block the animal's exit, and not to attempt handling. Bowl give her space, 3 feet from the door. If she can leave, the rocker waited, let her leave. With its gray-flowered cushions sagging in the middle. The bobcat's eyes Clara had not eased herself down with a small sound. She opened her mouth slightly, was not tasting the wet air with a silent grimace. Her left knee had been complaining since dawn. Once she lifted her injured paw and set it down again in a shallow flow, then pulled it close with a sharp little jerk, and began. She was terrified, but her stare had the dignity of a creature who had not given anyone permission to pity her. Eli lowered his window 3 inches. Rain blew into the truck. For nearly an hour. Aaron almost told him to close it, but Eli held out one apple slice between 2 covered fingers and placed it on the inside edge of the door, not offering it to the bobcat, just setting it down as if all frightened beings deserved something ordinary nearby. The bobcat would never eat apple. Eli probably knew that. Still, the gesture made Aaron smile despite the cold water soaking through his socks. The bobcat moved low. Shoulder blades arrived 30 minutes later in a green truck that smelled faintly of disinfectant, canvas, and old coffee. Though one still clung near the pale scratch below her brow, carried a collapsible crate, and moved with the unhurried care of someone who respected teeth. Gave her the same severe expression, as if the whole world remained under review. Together, Mara and Aaron set up a loose barrier with cones and a blanket from the county truck, leaving the culvert mouth open enough that the bobcat could choose movement. Because apparently, Mr. Pickle would have considered the whole arrangement insulting, Aaron thought, and the thought steadied him. Lifted her head, the rain softened to mist, listened toward the ridge. A robin scolded from a salmonberry bush. Eli stepped from the truck only after Aaron nodded, then stood behind the open door, one hand resting on the smooth river stone in his pocket. Clara's needle stopped inside the fabric. For one breath, she looked at Aaron. Then she looked at Eli. Clara forced her hand to move again. The boy did not stare straight into her eyes. Out. He lowered his gaze to the wet gravel between them and opened his hand with palm down, fingers loose. That she sewed the lavender. It was the sign he used when too much was happening. Then he wanted the world to become gentle. The bobcat did not come closer. The bottom step. She did not soften, but she stopped rasping on the board. And in the cold rain beside the flooded road, in the air, that was the small thing she allowed them to keep. Mara Singh did not let the bobcat become a rescue story too quickly. Ears tall, that was the first thing Aaron noticed. She did not rush toward drama. She did not speak in bright promises. She studied the culvert, the water level, but the angle of the animal's shoulders, and every space where fear could turn into panic. Then she asked Aaron for the road blanket, 2 cones. and silence.
Clara's heart beat so
The rain
hard
had
she heard
thinned
it
into
louder
mist
than the
that clung
rocker.
to every sleeve.
She thought of Thomas
Water
guiding
dripped
a
from the
frightened
alder
calf
branches and
away
made
from
rings in the
wire.
muddy pool at Aaron's
She
boots.
thought of Milo holding
Eli
his breath
stood behind
over
the
a
open
moth
truck
cupped in
door,
a jar.
his blue hood pulled low,
She thought of
breathing
all
through
the
his
ways
mouth because
love
wet
tried to
gravel
hurry,
and exhaust made the
and
air
all
too
the ways
sharp.
hurrying ruined
Inside
what
the
love
culvert,
wanted.
the Bobcat watched them as
So
if
she
the whole
looked
world
down at
had
her
narrowed
quilt.
to hands and exits.
The
Mara
Bobcat
set the
climbed
crate
to the
near
porch,
the pipe, but
not
not
gracefully,
against it.
but with
She
careful
placed a
suspicion.
folded towel
Her
inside,
back feet
then backed
paused on
away.
the step below,
The
while her
Bobcat
front
flattened her
paws
ears.
tested the boards.
Her short
She
tail gave
sniffed
one
the
hard
mid-pot.
twitch.
She sniffed
She
the little
shifted her
table.
good paw forward
She
and drew
sniffed
back,
Clara's
the
damp
injured
boot,
paw hovering
then
above the
recoiled
cold
with a
trickle
small
of water.
silent jerk that made Clara whisper,
She may choose the
"Fair
crate
enough."
if we make the ditch less
The
interesting.
Bobcat did not
Mara
run.
murmured.
She
Aaron
edged
understood
under the
Rose,
porch glider.
but watching a
The
wild
old
young
green one
cat
Thomas
decide
had
whether
found at a
humans
church
were worse
sale
than pain,
and painted
he
badly in
felt
a color
clumsy.
he called river
He had
moss.
spent years trying to guide
Beneath
Eli
it,
toward school doors,
the Bobcat tucked
doctor
herself
offices,
into the
and
narrow
noisy
shade,
family dinners.
her body hidden
Too often,
except for the
Aaron
torn
had
ear
confused help
and the
with
pale
pushing.
curve of one cheek.
The Bobcat taught him the difference
Clara
before
rocked
anyone
once.
named it. They waited.
The
A
Bobcat
wild creature could be
flinched,
present without
then
announcing
stayed.
itself. It could learn a
Clara
person's
rocked
route,
again.
judge his hands, decide
The
whether the
Bobcat
world was
lowered her
safe,
chin
and
onto
still
her
keep
paws.
its distance. It
The
did not
moment
owe
was so
closeness just
small
because someone
that
wished
anyone
for
driving
it.
past would have
Years
missed it.
later, Aaron would
An
understand
elderly
why
woman
that
sewing
mattered.
crooked quilt
Back then,
squares.
he only knew that
A
his son
half-wild
often
Bobcat
watched
under
from
a glider.
thresholds.
A porch
Eli
beginning
stood
to
at
hold
the edge
two
of rooms
kinds of
during family
loneliness,
gatherings,
without asking
close enough
either
to
one
listen,
to explain itself.
far enough not to be touched.
Clara
He
swallowed.
learned people by footsteps.
She had not
Lydia's were
realized
quick
how
and padded.
empty the floorboards
His grandmother
had sounded,
shuffled.
until
Aaron's had a
another
small
breathing
drag
creature
when his
rested
right
on
knee
them.
ached. Eli could tell
After
who was
a
coming
while,
before anyone called his
she
name.
began humming.
Lydia worried at night.
Not the hymn this
She worried
time,
about school,
but an
cruelty,
old tune
and a
Thomas
world
used
that
to
praised
whistle
loud
when he
children
sharpened
and missed
mower
quiet
blades.
courage. She made
Bobcat's
lists,
eyes
packed
stayed
extra
half
shirts,
open.
wrote notes to
Her
teachers,
ears moved
and
with
slept
every
lightly
note.
in case Eli
Not
woke after
relaxed
crowded
exactly,
days. Aaron
but less
worried
guarded
differently.
than before.
He worried in the shed,
A
sanding
walnut
boards
dropped
that
near
did
the
not
shed.
need sanding. He worried
The
under the truck
Bobcat's
hood.
head shot up.
Yet each time Eli passed
So
behind
did
him
mine,
and rested
Clara
two
murmured,
fingers briefly on
pressing
his
a
shoulder.
hand to
Not
her
a
chest.
hug. Not quite.
The
but
Bobcat
something
stared
chosen.
at the walnut,
Aaron felt the
as
whole
if it had
day
insulted
loosen.
her ancestors.
The Calder house learned the language
Then
of small
she
permissions.
settled again,
No one grabbed
turning
Eli's
3
hands.
tight circles
No one
beneath the
forced him
glider
into photographs.
before lying down
The porch light
in
stayed
the opposite
warm,
direction.
but never too bright.
Clara took
brass
this as a
bell rang
very
once.
official
The chipped
correction of
mug
the
remained
porch
near the
arrangement.
radio. The uneven
The
step
warmth of the
complained
day
under every
thickened.
visitor except Eli,
Cedar
who
scent
knew
rose
exactly
from the
where to
damp
place
rail.
his foot, so it
A
would
fly
stay
wandered
quiet.
near the Bobcat-esque
And
nose,
somewhere beyond the
and
house,
she snapped at it
beyond the
without
blackberry
lifting her
fence and the
head,
dripping furs,
missed
a
entirely,
bobcat moved through the hills,
then looked away
silent
as if the
and
fly
watchful,
had never interested
belonging
her.
to no one.
Clara
the first
did not
time
laugh
Aaron
aloud.
Calder saw the bobcat who would become
She
Juniper,
only smiled
she
into
was
her
not
sewing.
standing proud beneath a porch
Milo
light.
came by after
She
school.
was a shadow inside a
but
roadside
Clara
culvert,
saw him through
half
the
hidden
lilacs
behind rainwater
before he
and
reached
flattened
the gate.
grass.
She
It was a
raised
Thursday
one
in
finger
early
to her
April,
lips.
the kind of Oregon
He
day that
stopped
made
so
everything
quickly
smell
his
washed
backpack
and
slid
tired.
down both arms.
Low clouds pressed
When he
against
saw
the
the
hills,
Bobcat
and water
beneath
ran
the
in
glider,
silver threads down the ditch
his
banks
eyes
beside
widened.
Miller Creek Road.
He did
Aaron
not
had
come
been called
closer.
out because a bus driver reported
Instead,
flooding near mile
He
marker
sat
7.
cross-legged in the
He
grass
brought Eli
beside the
only
fence,
because school was closed,
holding a
and
library
Lydia
book
had an
against his
appointment in
knees,
Eugene.
and reading
Eli
without
was
turning a
10,
page.
long-limbed and quiet,
Clara noticed
wearing
and
his
hid
blue
her
rain
smile
jacket
in the
with the
blanket.
sleeves pulled over his hands.
The Bobcat
He sat in the
him
county
too.
truck, watching
One
drops
golden
chase
eye
one another
opened.
across the window.
Her torn
Aaron
ear
had
angled
packed the
toward
things
the
he
boy,
always packed when Eli
then
came along:
toward Clara.
headphones, apple slices
Milo
cut thin,
lifted
a
two
smooth
fingers
river
in the
stone,
smallest
and the
possible
laminated
greeting.
card with Eli's hand signs.
The Bobcat
The windshield
blinked
wipers
once.
knocked back and forth with a tired
Milo
rubber
later
squeak.
claimed it was a conversation.
Aaron liked having him there. He liked
Clara
how Eli
let him
noticed
have
culvert
it.
numbers painted on concrete
By late
rings
afternoon,
and leaned
the
forward
sun
whenever
slipped
water
behind
changed
Briar
sound.
Ridge and the porch cooled.
Sometimes Aaron
the Bobcat
imagined they were
rose
two
as
quiet
silently as
workers
she had
assigned to
come.
the same weather.
She stretched,
At mile
front
marker
paws
7,
long,
the ditch had
back arched
clogged with
high,
alder branches
claws
and mud.
briefly catching
Water
in a crack
pooled
between
against
the
the road
boards.
shoulder, brown
Then
and
she
restless.
stepped from beneath the glider,
Aaron
walked
parked with the
past the
hazard
rocker,
lights blinking
and paused
told Eli to
close
stay
enough
in the cab
that
while
Clara
he checked
could
the
see
pipe.
a tiny
Eli
seed
nodded,
caught
but
in
his
the
eyes
fur
had
below
already
her
gone
chin.
toward the culvert mouth.
Clara did
Aaron
not
heard
reach
it
for
only
it.
after he stepped into the ditch.
The bobcat
Not a
looked
cry.
at the moving chair.
Not quite. A rough, small
Forward.
rasp came from inside the pipe, swallowed
Back.
quickly by rushing water.
Then
Aaron
she followed
froze
the
with one
motion
boot
with
in
her
the
head.
mud. The rain
Slow
ticked on
and
his hood.
steady.
Again the
as if
sound
the
came,
creak
sharper
had
this
become
time,
something
followed
worth
by a scrape of
remembering.
claws against corrugated
When
metal.
she finally slipped
He
down the
crouched.
steps and
Two
vanished
amber
toward
eyes
the woodpile,
stared back from the dark.
the porch did not feel
Aaron's
empty.
breath shortened. At first,
felt
his mind
waiting.
made the animal smaller than it was.
By the second week,
a house cat maybe
Clara
washed in by
stopped
the
calling
storm.
the bobcat the
But
bobcat
then the eyes
inside
shifted
her
and he
own
saw the
mind.
broad cheek ruff, the
She
barred
still used
forelegs,
caution
the
with
short
her
tail
hands,
tucked
her
hard
voice,
along one
and
side.
her habits.
A bobcat.
She still listened to Dr. Lila
She was
Marsh
young,
when Lila
perhaps not
reminded
fully
her
grown,
that
but old enough
familiarity
to carry the
was
hard
not the
knowledge
same
of
as
hunger
tameness.
and weather.
She still kept
Her
the blue
fur clung
enamel
in wet
bowl
clumps.
3 feet from the door
Burrs
and never
freckled her
closer.
chest.
But a creature
One
could
ear
not
was torn
spend
near
that
the
many
tip in a
mornings
crescent
beneath
shape.
a woman-esque
She held her
porch
right
glider,
front paw close
studying her
and low,
rocking foot
favoring
with
it
such
without showing
solemn
much
concentration.
weakness.
And
Bobcats
remain
were
only a
masters of
description.
pretending pain did not exist.
Clara named
Even
her
trapped
Bracken.
and soaked, she tried to look like
She
something
chose it
that could still
quietly,
vanish.
while folding
Aaron
towels at
backed away
Moke-Fee, the
slowly.
kitchen table,
His first
with
thought
rain
was
tapping
Eli.
the window,
His
and the
second
smell
was that
of
he had
cinnamon
no
toast
idea what to do.
lingering from breakfast.
He had lifted
It suited
raccoons
the
from storm
bobcat
drains
better
with
than
a borrowed
anything
crate
sweet
and a
would
prayer.
have. Bracken
He had
was
stopped
brown
traffic
and
for
wild
deer and once
low to
carried a
the
stunned
earth.
owl in his lunch
It bent
cooler
under
after
frost
lining it
and
with his
rose
flannel
again
shirt.
when the season
But
allowed.
a bobcat
It
was
belonged
different,
to ridges,
stronger,
shadows,
quicker,
and hidden places.
more private in its fear.
When Clara whispered the name
From
the
the
first
truck,
time,
Eli tapped the
she
window
did not
once.
expect the
The
bobcat
porch
to
light had
answer.
always made a small
Bracken
amber
did
circle on the
not.
wet boards. But
She
that
was
evening,
under the lilac
it seemed
bush,
to hold its
watching
breath.
a beetle move
Rain
across
had been
a leaf
falling since
with the
late
fixed
afternoon
attention
in the
of a
Oregon
judge.
foothills.
When the
A
beetle
soft,
reached the edge and
silver
dropped out
rain
of
that
sight,
threaded through
Bracken
the fir
looked
trees
offended,
and
as if
tapped
the
on the
little
metal
thing
roof of the
had
Calder
broken an
house.
agreement.
It
Then she
darkened
turned
the
one
porch
golden eye
steps,
toward Clara,
gathered along
and
the
yawned
repaired
wide
gate
enough
latch,
to show small,
and made the
sharp
garden
teeth.
smell of cedar needles,
Well,
damp
Clara
soil,
said,
and crushed
Moat
mint
will take
from
that
Lydia
as your
Calder's
opinion.
herb boxes.
The name stayed
Inside,
anyway.
dishes cooled in the sink after
By then,
Eli's 22nd
The
birthday
porch
dinner.
had gained a second
A
rhythm.
blue blanket lay folded over the
Clara
rocking
S.
chair
rocker creaked
because
after
his grandmother
breakfast.
still believed
Again
every
near
porch
noon
needed
when
a
her
blanket,
knees wanted rest.
even in June.
And once more
Eli
at dusk,
stood
when
just
the ridge
inside the
turned
screen
blue.
door, with his fingers
Bracken
resting
began
on the
appearing
frame.
at those times.
He had
with
not
a
spoken
regularity
much
that
that day.
unsettled Clara
He rarely
more than
did when too
surprise
many
ever
people
had.
filled the house.
She
His
never
cousins
came
had
running.
tried to be gentle.
Nothing about Bracken
His uncle
hurried for
had
human
kept his
comfort.
voice low.
She
His
arrived
mother
as if
had
the
set
shadows
the
had
candles
loosened
away
and let
before
her
the
pass
singing,
through.
because flame and
Sometimes
sudden
Clara
noise
saw her
had never
first
been easy for
by
him.
the torn left ear
Still,
rising beyond the
Eli
steps.
had pressed both
Sometimes
hands over
by the
his
pale
ears when
scratch
everyone
below her
clapped.
brow.
And
Sometimes
Aaron
only
Calder
by the
had felt
sudden
the old
silence
ache in
of
his
the
chest,
squirrels in
the one that
walnut tree.
came whenever he wanted to protect
But
his
when the
son from the
rocker
whole
moved,
bright, careless
Bracken
world.
moved too.
Then the yard went silent.
If Clara leaned
Not
forward to
ordinary
set down her
silent.
mug,
Not the lull
Bracken
between jokes
edged from
or the
beneath the
pause after
hydrangeas.
rain softened.
if Clara
This
rocked
was the
back
silence
and
of
tucked
every
the blanket
wild
tighter
thing,
around her
choosing
lap,
stillness at
Bracken
once.
settled onto
The
her
family
haunches.
noticed it slowly.
If the chair paused,
Lydia stopped wiping the counter.
Bracken paused.
Aunt Margot lowered
It
a
was
fork
not
back to her
affection
plate.
in the easy way
Aaron,
people wished
who had
for.
worked 27 years
It was
repairing
attention.
backcountry culverts
It
for the
was
county,
memory taking
turned
shape.
toward the porch because
The
he
first
knew
time
what
Milo
silence in
saw
the
it
woods could
clearly,
mean.
He nearly
At
forgot
the far edge
porch
of the light
rules.
stood a bobcat. She
"She's
was older
copying
now,
you," he whispered.
leaner than memory. Her
Clara
ruff
lifted
had
one
thinned
finger.
into a ragged summer collar.
Milo
And
pressed
one
both
ear
hands
held the
over
same
his mouth.
crescent notch near the tip.
Bracken,
Rain
hearing the
jeweled
whisper
along her
anyway,
whiskers.
turned
A
her
pale
head and
scar
stared at him
crossed the bridge
until
of her
he
nose.
lowered his eyes like
Her
a
paws
boy
remained
caught
in the
talking
grass
during
beyond the
church.
steps, not entering
Then
the
she
porch,
stepped behind
not
the mint
begging,
pot and sat
not
there,
tame. She
pretending
only
the pot
watched.
hid all of
Aaron's
her,
hand found the
though her
back of a
spotted
kitchen chair.
hindquarters remained
6 years had
plainly
passed
visible.
since the last time they had seen her.
Milo's shoulders
No
shook
one said her
silently.
name at first. The word
Clara
would have
looked
been
toward
too
the
heavy
pasture,
to set down in that
because
room.
laughter,
But Eli
if
knew.
released too quickly,
His shoulders, tight
undo
all
the
evening
whole
from voices
afternoon.
and birthday wishes, lowered
After
by a
that,
fraction.
Milo
His fingers
called
left the
Bracken
door
Grant's
frame
shadow
and opened
when he
slowly,
spoke of her to Rachel.
palm turned down.
Rachel did
The
not
same
like the
careful
sound of
shape
it at
he had
first.
made as a boy,
She
when
worried
words had
about
tangled
scratches,
inside him, and the world
sickness,
had asked too much.
attachment,
The bobcat's eyes
heartbreak,
narrowed, not
and
in
all
fear,
the practical
but in
troubles
that slow,
daughters
deliberate
collected,
way
when
cats
mothers
sometimes
insisted
had,
on living
as
alone
if closing
near
out
woods.
everything except the one
"She is
thing
not
they
a
had
pet,"
chosen to trust.
Rachel said over the phone.
She blinked once, softly,
"No," Clara
fully.
answered.
Then she opened
Watching
her
Bracken
eyes and
sniff
kept
the
them on
rocker's
Eli.
front leg with
Lydia
deep
covered her
suspicion.
mouth. Aaron looked away
"She is a neighbor
because he had
with poor
promised
manners."
himself years earlier
At
that if
that
this
exact
animal ever
moment,
returned, he
Bracken
would not
hooked
make
one
it about
paw
his own grief.
under the edge of the porch rug,
Yet his
and
eyes
flipped it
burned
halfway over,
anyway.
revealing
He had
3
learned
dry
not to
leaves
expect
and a
wild
beetle
things
beneath.
to come back.
She
He had
stared
learned
at
it
the
from work,
discovery,
from weather,
then
from his
at
own
Clara,
father's early death,
as if
and
accusing
from the
her
empty
of
place
hiding
that had
entertainment.
remained by the back fence
Clara
after
had to
Juniper
turn away
vanished
from
into
the
the
window.
timber. But there
Daily
she was,
life adjusted
beneath the
around
porch
the
light,
wild shape
carrying
at its
the
edge.
rain on her fur like a
The
memory that
mailman,
had walked
Mr.
home.
Alvarez,
For a
learned
while,
to leave packages on
nobody
the top
moved.
fence rail
The
instead
old
of stepping
Calder
onto
house
the porch
sat outside
when the blue
Maple
bowl was
Glen,
out.
where
He once
Douglas
saw
firs
Bracken
climbed hard into the
ears above
hills.
the hydrangeas and
Porch
backed down
boards
the
creaked
path
in three
so
places,
slowly his
and a
mailbag
spoon
bumped
wind
every
chime
picket.
clicked whenever
Later,
weather
he told
shifted.
Clara he had delivered
Eli
to barking
liked it
dogs,
because it never
escaped
demanded an
goats,
answer.
and one turkey
If
with
this
a personal
quiet story
grudge,
found a
but
soft
never
place
to
in
a
someone's
porch
heart,
supervised by
they
a
could
bobcat.
like and subscribe and
Clara
leave a note
thanked
about
him
where
with
they were
pear
watching
preserves.
from, or the name of an
He
animal
accepted
that once
them
stayed
like
with
hazard
them.
pay.
On that wet
Bracken
birthday
disliked
evening,
the mail truck.
even the small
She
things
vanished
seemed to
before it
gather
turned
around
into the
Eli
lane,
kindly.
then returned
His
only
cousin's
after
little
the
girl
engine
stopped
noise had
chewing
dissolved
cake and
beyond
whispered,
the bend.
"Is she
She
real?"
disliked Rachel S.
The
perfume
family's
even
orange
more.
tabby,
Whenever
Mr.
Rachel
Pickle,
visited after
puffed
work,
himself into a
Bracken
round,
retreated to
offended
the
loaf
woodpile
beneath the
and
table.
stayed there with her
Then
ears
wisely
flattened,
decided the
while
hallway
Rachel
needed
stood
guarding.
on the porch,
Lydia's
holding
mother
soup
slid
containers
Eli's untouched
and trying
slice
not to
farther
look
from the
insulted.
door, as if a
Mott
bobcat
saved
might
people
judge
as
the
lives for a
frosting.
living, Rachel
Juniper
murmured
flicked
once.
one ear toward the
But
tabby's
apparently
retreat.
would smell
Her
suspicious.
short tail twitched once.
She has
She turned her
refined
head
taste,
slightly,
Clara said.
scenting the wet steps,
Rachel
the
set
porch
the soup
rail, the
on the
people,
little table.
the years.
You re-enjoying
Bobcats
this
did
too
not
much?
waste movement. Every
Clara
shift of her
was.
weight looked measured.
Not
Her
because
hind
Rachel
foot
was
favored
uneasy,
the left side
but
for a
because the house
heartbeat,
had begun
then
making
steadied.
room for soft
She
absurdities
remained a
again.
creature of thickets and
bobcat
creek
judging
beds,
perfume,
of dusk
a
trails
grandson
and hidden
reading
dens.
field guides in the
The
grass,
porch light had not
a
changed
mailman
that.
negotiating
Eli's
with
presence had
hydrangeas.
not changed that.
These were not cures
Love
for
had
grief.
not made her less
Clara
wild.
did not believe in
That
cures
was what
for
broke
a love
Aaron
that had
most
lasted
gently,
most of her
because
life.
when Eli was
But they
small,
were small
people
lanterns
had often
placed along
spoken
a dark
about him
path,
as
and
if
she
love
had
should
learned
pull him
not to
closer
refuse
to
light
the shape they
just because
expected.
it was small.
More words,
Bracken's
more
own
eye
habits
contact,
became familiar.
more ease in bright rooms.
She always approached
Aaron
the blue
had
bowl
tried,
from the left,
clumsily
never
at
the
first,
right.
to help.
She pawed
He
once
had wanted
at the
to
water
build a
before
bridge to
drinking,
him,
as
the
if
way he
checking
built
whether it had
bridges over
changed its
washouts
mind.
and gullies,
She avoided
with
the third
plans
porch board
and the
from
right
the
kind
bottom.
of bolts.
Though Clara could
But
find
Eli had
nothing wrong
never
with
been
it,
a bridge
except an
project.
old stain
He had been a
shaped
boy,
vaguely like
listening
a
to
fish.
things others
She watched
missed.
Clara's hands
He had heard
whenever
rain
thread
inside
moved
walls,
through fabric.
owls
And once,
beyond closed
when a
windows,
spool rolled off the
the
table,
hum of old bulbs
Bracken trapped
before
it
they
beneath
gave out.
one paw and held
He had
it there
noticed
for
when
nearly
Lydia
a minute
changed laundry
before
soap,
letting it escape.
and when Aaron was sad,
Milo whispered,
even if Aaron kept smiling.
"She considering adoption."
And 6 years before that birthday,
She says
he
considering
had noticed
charges,
fear
Clara
in a
said.
wounded bobcat before
At
any
dusk,
adult
when
knew
the
how to
air
name
smelled
it.
of wood smoke from
Now
distant
beneath the
chimneys
porch light,
and crushed
Eli took
mint
one
near the
careful
steps,
step forward.
Bracken sometimes
Aaron
followed,
almost
the
told him to
rockerous
stop.
motion from the yard for
The old
so
father
long
in him
that
rose
Clara
fast,
felt the watching
full of
become
warnings,
almost companionable.
distance,
The
claws,
bobcat did
teeth,
not want to be touched.
wild animal.
She did not want
But the
walls,
man who had
collars,
spent
commands,
years
or claims.
learning from both his son
But she
and the
wanted the chair
bobcat
to keep
held
moving.
his tongue.
Clara
Eli did
understood
not
that
open the
more than
screen
she
door.
wished to.
He did not reach.
There had been days
He only
after
lowered
Thomas
himself
died
to
when
sit
she
on
had
the
kept
worn
rocking,
inside mat,
simply because stopping
knees
made the
drawn
silence too
his
complete.
palms still open against
Forward
the mesh.
and back had given her
Juniper
body
stared
something
at
to
him through
believe
the
in
rain-specked
when her
screen.
heart had not known
The house
where to
waited.
rest.
Then she
Now,
blinked again.
At the edge of
This
the porch
time,
light,
Eli blinked
Bracken
back.
moved when she moved.
Long before Juniper came back
Not
beneath the
owned.
porch light, the Calder house
Not
had
tame.
already belonged to quiet things.
Still wild
It
enough
stood
to
at the
disappear
last bend
between
of
two
Tiller
breaths.
Road, where the pavement
Yet
thinned,
evening after
the
evening,
mailboxes leaned,
when
and
Clara
the
settled
forest
into the
seemed
rocker,
to step
and the
closer
first
each
creak
year.
crossed the yard,
Blackberry
the
vines
torn
hooked
left
the fence
ear
rails
appeared
in
from
summer,
the shadows,
and winter fog
Bracken
slid
came
between
to
the fir
follow.
trunks before breakfast.
Quiet joy did
The house
not
had
arrive
once
at Clara
belonged to
Whitcomb's
Aaron's father,
house like a
who
bell
had
ringing.
built the porch with his own square
It came in
hands
small,
and left
almost
one step
visible
uneven
pieces,
because
the
he
way
said a
sunlight
house
slipped
needed
through
one
the porch
honest
railing
flaw.
and made gold
Aaron
bars
never
across
fixed
the
that step.
floorboards.
He said it was
came in the
because he
soft
had
clink
not found
of
the
blue
time.
enamel bowl
But
each
Lydia
morning.
knew better.
It came in
Some
Milo's
things remained
careful
because
footsteps
removing
along
them
the fence
felt
line,
like saying
in
goodbye
Rachel's
twice.
soup jars cooling
Aaron
on the kitchen
Calder
sill,
was 41
in the
when
loose
Eli
gate
was
latch
born.
tapping beyond
By
the
then,
pasture,
he had worked for
as
the
if
county
keeping
road
time
crew
for
for nearly
lives
2
that had not
decades,
gone still.
clearing ditches,
By late
inspecting
October,
culverts,
the
and
hills
driving
around
the
Briar
same white
Ridge
service
had
truck
turned
through
copper and
storms.
wine dark red.
He woke before
The
dawn,
air smelled
drank
of dry
coffee
leaves,
from a chipped green
wood
mug,
smoke, and the
checked
sharp
the
green
kitchen
breath
radio,
of mint
tapped
whenever
twice on the
Bracken
window
brushed too
frame
close
before
to the
leaving,
cracked pot.
and carried
Clara
a
wore
pocket
Thomas
notebook
Uss's
full of
old
measurements.
flannel coat, over her
He had
brown
not
cardigan
expected
now,
fatherhood to
while the
frighten him so
sleeves
much.
swallowed her hands.
With Eli,
She
the
told
fear
herself
came
it was
softly.
practical. Everyone
the baby
else
did
knew.
not like being
She wore it
rocked
because
like
the
other
collar
babies.
still held some
He
memory of
stiffened
him
when relatives
when
leaned
rain
too
was
close.
coming.
Certain sounds
Bracken
made
had
him
grown
cry with
fuller
a
through
thin,
the
desperate
weeks,
intensity
not round,
that left Aaron
never
standing
soft,
helpless
but
in the
less hollow
hallway.
at the ribs.
Lydia
The
lured
burrs
faster.
had worked free from
She
her
dimmed
shoulder.
lamps.
The
She
torn
warmed
left ear
blankets in the
remained,
dryer.
and
She
the bent
hummed
whisker still
without
gave her
words.
face a look
And
of permanent
sometimes
judgment.
Eli settled
She had
against her
begun to
shoulder,
groom on the
as
porch
if
with
listening
brisk
for a
dignity,
small boat
drawing one
on dark
paw
water.
over her cheek,
By the
pausing to
time
listen,
Eli was
then
4,
returning
the
to the
doctors
task
had
as
given
if
the family a
cleanliness were
word
a
for part
serious
of what they
forest
already
duty.
knew:
She
autism.
still would not be touched.
Lydia cried in the parking lot
Clara
afterward,
never tried.
not because she was ashamed,
That,
but because she was tired
too,
of pretending she had
became
not been
part
worried.
of their language.
Aaron folded the
On
appointment
calm
papers
mornings,
so carefully
Clara rocked
that one
while
corner
piecing
tore.
the lavender quilt
He
across
wanted
her
an
lap.
instruction sheet.
Bracken
He
watched
wanted a
the
map.
needle flash
His
in and
job
out,
had taught him
eyes
that
narrowing
water
at
could
the
be
thread whenever
redirected
it tugged
and
through
roads
cloth.
could be reopened.
Once, a
But
square
his son
slipped from
was
Clara
not a
S.
flooded
knee and
ditch.
fluttered to the boards.
Eli was a boy
Bracken
who lined
sprang
his
backward,
crayons by shade,
landed beside the water
refused
bowl,
socks
and
with
stared
raised
at the
seams,
harmless fabric.
pressed his
They
ear
kept
to the
it
refrigerator,
hot, such
and
betrayal
smiled
that
at
Clara
the
had
motor's
to hide her
steady
laugh
throat.
inside a cough.
He did not answer when
You'd have
neighbors
made a
asked
poor
questions,
seamstress,
but he
Clara
noticed when
murmured.
Mrs. Klein's old terrier
Bracken
limped
sat,
and placed one of his
lifted her
crackers
chin,
near the fence
and
without
deliberately
looking
looked
at her.
away.
He disliked birthday
Milo
songs,
came more often
grocery
once he
store
understood.
lights,
The
vacuum
rules were not
cleaners,
chores,
and
but a kind of quiet
fork-scraping plates.
invitation.
He
brought
loved rain,
homework,
smooth
biscuits
stones,
wrapped in
the
wax
number
paper,
7,
and a
and the little
patience
brass
Clara
bell
had not
hanging
seen
by the
in
back
many
door.
grown people.
The
He
bell
sat
had
in the
belonged
grass
to
near
Lydia's
the fence,
grandmother.
far
Eli
enough
rang
not to
it
crowd
once each
Bracken,
evening,
and
never
close
twice,
enough that Clara
mark
could
the
hear
day
his
as
pencil
finished.
scratch.
It became one of the
Sometimes
house's
he
small
read from his
mercies.
biology book
Even
in a low
Mr.
voice.
Pickle, who had arrived
Not to
as a
Bracken
half-starved
exactly,
kitten and grown
but
into
to
a
the
cat with the
afternoon.
confidence of a retired mayor,
Bobcats are
came to
crepuscular,
respect
he
the
whispered
bell.
one day.
He sat beside the rug
Clara looked
with his
over her
tail
glasses.
folded over his paws,
That
looking
sounds like a
deeply
disease.
inconvenienced, but present.
It means
There were
active
warm
at dawn
days
and
too,
dusk.
more than people
Then what
outside
meant
the family
crepuscular
guessed.
too?
Eli laughed
Milo
whenever
grinned
Aaron
into his
sneezed in the
notebook.
barn dust, because Aaron's
Bracken,
sneeze sounded
offended by the
embarrassingly
conversation,
like a
or
startled
perhaps by
goose.
vocabulary in general,
Lydia once
pinned
found
her
all
ears
the
at a
spoons
squirrel
arranged
and
in a
gave
perfect
one
silver
silent lash
fan
of her tail.
across the kitchen
The
table.
squirrel dropped a
And
walnut
instead of
from
correcting
the tree.
him,
It struck
she
the
placed a
porch roof
daisy
with
at
a
the
hollow
center,
thud.
making
Milo
Eli
jumped.
grin.
Clara
Every
jumped.
Friday,
Bracken
Aaron
did
burned
not.
one corner
She
of the
only
grilled
stared
cheese,
upward,
and
as
every
if
Friday,
she had expected
Eli
better
quietly
manners
traded
from the
plates
sky.
with him because he liked
Their
the bitter
warmest
edge
moments
better.
often looked like
Their love
nothing
learned to
anyone
travel by
else.
side roads.
A
Aaron
biscuit
struggled
crumb
with that
fell
at
from
first.
Milo's napkin.
He had grown
and
up in a
landed near
family
the
where
fence.
men loved
Bracken
by
ignored
fixing,
it.
carrying,
Vacapite hot
paying,
royal,
and saying very little.
restraint for the length of an
After
entire
his own
page
father
of reading,
died in a
then
spring
drifted
logging
over when
accident,
nobody looked,
Aaron
and
was
sniffed the
19
ground so
and
delicately
angry at
her
every
whiskers barely
unfinished
moved.
sentence. He
She
did not
eat
want
the
Eli
crumb.
to inherit
She
that kind of
placed one
silence,
paw over it,
but he did
held
not
it there,
always know
and
how
watched
to offer
Milo
a better
until
one.
he whispered,
Eli
"You
saw
can keep it."
something in him and
Only
exposed
then
something
did she
else.
lick it up.
Some evenings, Aaron
Rachel
sat
saw
on the
her
porch
progress
after
in
work,
smaller ways.
boots unlaced,
When she
listening to
brought
tree
soup
frogs in the
after a
ditch.
long nursing
From
shift,
the ridge came sounds
Bracken
most
no
people
longer
ignored.
vanished at
A
once.
raven's wooden croak,
She opened
the
one
dry
eye
fall of
beneath the
cones,
glider,
the quick cry of prey
sniffed
beyond
Rachel's
sight.
perfume,
Bobcats lived up
sneezed
there.
once.
Aaron
and
had seen their
stayed.
tracks pressed neat and round
Still
in creek mud.
suspicious?
No
Rachel
claw
asked.
marks showing, because cats kept their
violently,
weapons
Clara
hidden
said.
until needed.
Clara
Once,
had
near a
spent months
culvert above
feeling as
Miller
if
Creek,
every good thing
he found a
required
scrape
permission
beneath a
from
cedar
grief.
root, and the faint,
Laughing
musky
too
scent
hard
of
felt
a territorial
disloyal.
marker.
Forgetting to ache
The
for an
animal
hour
had been
felt
nearby,
like misplacing
unseen,
Thomas twice.
watching him long
But
before he
Bracken,
knew it.
with her solemn
thought
little
stayed with
tyrannies,
him.
did not
A
leave
wild
space
creature
for that
could be
kind of
present
accounting.
without announcing
She was
itself.
hungry when hungry.
It could learn a
wary
person's
when
route,
wary,
judge his
sleepy when
hand,
the sun found
decide
the porch
whether the
boards.
world was safe,
She accepted
and
the
still
day
keep
without
its distance.
apologizing to
It
yesterday.
did not owe closeness just
Clara
because
watched
someone
her
wished
and
for
learned
it.
slowly.
Years later, Aaron
One
would
evening,
understand
while
why
Clara
that
shook
mattered.
out the blue blanket,
Back then,
a slipper
he only
slid
knew that
from
his
beneath
son
the rocker.
often watched from
Not
thresholds.
one of Clara's good house
Eli
shoes,
stood at the edge of
but the
rooms
old
during
plaid
family
one with the
gatherings,
flattened heel
close
she
enough to
wore,
listen,
only
far
when no
enough
one
not
could
to be
see,
touched.
except
He learned
someone
people
had
by
seen.
footsteps.
Bracken had
Lydia's were
dragged it
quick
under the
and
glider
padded.
and
His
tucked it
grandmother's
behind a
shuffled.
porch leg.
Aaron's
like
had a
stolen
small
treasure.
drag when his right knee ached.
Milo found it first. "Gran," he whispered, pointing. "She has a den collection." Clara stared at the slipper. Bracken sat beside it, torn ear angled proudly forward. one paw resting on the plaid toe. "That is not yours," Clara said. Bracken blinked. Milo whispered, "Mort think she disagrees." Clara reached for the slipper, then stopped with her hand still in the air. Bracken's body had not tensed, but her eyes had sharpened. The porch held its breath. Clara drew her hand back. "Fine," she said softly. "Borrowed." Then Bracken lowered her chin on the slipper, as if the legal matter had been settled. Milo laughed so quietly he folded in half. The stolen slipper remained beneath the glider for 3 days. Clara wore mismatched house shoes and pretended not to notice. Rachel noticed immediately and asked whether this was a new mountain fashion. Mr. Alvarez noticed too, and left the mail in the box without comment, though Clara saw his shoulders shaking as he walked away. On the 4th morning, the slipper appeared beside the rocker, damp at the edge but unharmed. Clara looked toward the hydrangeas. Bracken washed one paw and refused all responsibility. By then, the title Milo had given her had spread through the family like a soft joke. Gran S. Shadow. Not because Bracken belonged to Clara, and not because she followed every step. She did not. She disappeared for hours into the ridge. She hunted in silence. She returned with leaf dust on her paws and secrets in her fur. But when dusk came, when Clara settled into the rocker and the old boards cooled beneath the fog, Bracken emerged. Forward. The chair creaked. Forward. The Bobcat stepped. Back. The chair sighed. Back. Bracken settled. And Clara, wrapped in Thomas' coat with the lavender quilt growing across her knees, felt the porch no longer keeping her grief company alone. The warning signs began so gently that Clara almost mistook them for weather. Late autumn had a way of making every living thing seem restless. Leaves broke loose from the ridge in sudden flurries and skated across the yard. The creek ran colder, speaking over stones in a thin silver rush. At night, frost silvered the pasture grass and made the fence rails shine under the moon like old bones. Even the loose gate latch sounded sharper, tapping in the wind with a nervous little clack that carried all the way to Clara's bedroom window. So when Bracken began spending longer stretches near the fence line, Clara told herself the Bobcat was only listening to the season change. But she watched. She could not help watching. Bracken no longer came to the porch as smoothly as before. Some mornings, the blue enamel bowl sat untouched until nearly noon. Other days, Bracken appeared at dawn, drank quickly, and vanished before Clara could settle the blanket over her knees. The torn left ear still lifted at Molf, the first creak of the rocker, but the rest of her body seemed pulled towards something beyond the yard. She paced. Not often enough to frighten anyone at first. Just a narrow path along the garden fence, from the blackberry canes to the leaning post near the pasture. Back and forth she went, nose low, whiskers trembling, paws placing themselves with silent precision. Sometimes she stopped and stared toward Briar Ridge for so long that Clara St. cooled in the chipped yellow mug. Forward. The chair creaked. Bracken did not always follow. That was what Clara noticed most. The first evening it happened, Clara rocked once, expecting the familiar shift at the edge of the porch light. Bracken remained by the fence, her body angled toward the trees. Her tail tip flicked, not playful, not irritated, but quick and tight. The muscles over her shoulders moved beneath her coat, like small questions. Clara drew the blue blanket higher. "Something out there?" she whispered. Bracken's ears flattened, then rose again. No answer came from the ridge except wind through dry oak leaves. Milo noticed the change that Thursday. He had brought a paper sack of cinnamon rolls from Rachel, 3 for Clara, and one that he claimed had become damaged, and therefore belonged to him immediately. He sat in his usual place near the fence, unwrapping the sticky paper with great seriousness, while Bracken stood 20 feet away, staring past him. "She's not judging my food," he whispered. "That is unusual," Clara said. "She always judges my food." Bracken turned, sniffed once in Milo's direction, then looked away as if even cinnamon was beneath consideration. Milo lowered the roll. "Should we be worried?" Clara did not answer quickly. A grandmother learned that worry spoken too soon became heavier in a child's hands. She looked at Bracken's ribs, at the way her breath moved, at the torn ear cutting against the pale afternoon. The bobcat did not look weak. She looked alert. More than alert. Summoned. "What think?" Clara said slowly. "We should pay attention." Milo nodded with the solemn pride of being trusted with a real answer. That night, Clara called Dr. Lila Marsh. She stood by the kitchen window with the phone pressed to her ear, watching Bracken's shape move in and out of moon-striped shadows near the woodpile. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon, cooling soup, and the faint mineral dampness of the old sink. Rachel's jars sat washed and upside down on a towel. Lila listened. "Could be territory," she said. "Could be prey movement. Could be another animal passing through. Bobcats have reasons we don't get to know." Clara rested her fingertips on the windowsill. "She keeps looking toward the ridge. That may be where her life is calling from." The words settled quietly, but not gently. Clara had known it from the beginning. Love did not erase the ridge. It did not turn a bobcat into something made for hearth rugs and supper bells. Bracken's life had begun beyond those trees, in hidden dens, under laurel roots, along paths Clara's feet would never find. The porch had become shelter, perhaps habit, perhaps even comfort, but it was not the whole world. Still, after she hung up, Clara stayed at the window. She wished Thomas were there to tell her when holding back was mercy, and when it was cowardice. She wished wanting Bracken to stay did not feel so much like wanting the woods to be smaller. The next morning brought frost hard enough to rim the blue bowl with ice. Clara carried warm water out slowly, her breath blooming white in front of her. The porch boards bit through her slippers. When she bent to replace the bowl, her knee twinged and she caught the rail with one hand. The rocker creaked behind her, moved by wind. Bracken appeared instantly. Not at the bowl, not under the lilac. At Clara's side of the yard, closer than she had stood before, golden eyes fixed on the rocking chair as it moved empty. For a strange second, Clara thought the bobcat had come for her. Then Bracken looked past Clara, toward the ridge, and gave a low, rough sound from deep in her throat. Clara went still. A crow burst from the walnut tree. Another followed. In the far brush, something cracked. Not loud, not near, but enough to make Bracken's body drop low, shoulders bunched, torn ear angled hard toward the sound. The moment passed. The yard returned to itself. Milo arrived later and found Clara sitting on the porch with mismatched slippers again, though Bracken had returned the stolen plaid 1 week ago. Clara had simply put on the wrong pair without noticing. Milo looked at her feet, then at her face, and said nothing for once. Instead, he set one cinnamon roll on the little table and placed a second napkin beside it. Empty. For moral support, he said. Clara smiled, but it did not reach far. Bracken spent that afternoon at the fence line. At one point, she pawed at the frozen ground beneath the blackberries, sniffed the soil, and rubbed her cheek against the leaning post, marking it with the scent glands near her jaw. Then she walked to the porch, sat below the rocker, and watched Clara with an expression too wild to read and too familiar to ignore. Forward. Back. This time, when Clara rocked, Bracken followed for only 3 slow steps. Then she turned toward Briar Ridge. The morning bracken disappeared. The porch sounded wrong before Clara understood why. A hard frost had settled overnight. It glazed the porch rail, stiffened the brown hydrangea stems, and turned every blade of pasture grass white. Even the loose gate latch had gone quiet, frozen by a skim of ice, and the silence it left behind felt larger than the sound ever had. Clara woke before dawn with her left knee aching and the uneasy sense that someone had called her name. No one had. The house was dim and cold, smelling faintly of last night's ashes and the peppermint tea Rachel had left by the stove. Clara tied her hair, buttoned Thomas's flannel coat over her nightgown, and carried warm water to the blue enamel bowl. Steam rose from it. When she opened the kitchen door, the rocker moved. Only once. The wind had slipped under the porch roof and nudged it forward. Then back. The old runners gave their familiar creak, tender and worn. Usually, that sound brought the shadow. Usually, somewhere beneath the lilac or near the woodpile, one torn ear lifted. A pair of golden eyes opened. A lean shape separated from the morning and came, not eagerly, never that, but with the steady attention of a creature who had decided the creak mattered. This time, nothing moved. Clara stepped onto the porch. The boards were slick beneath her slippers. She placed the warm bowl 3 feet from the door, exactly where it belonged. The water trembled, sending little rings toward the chipped rim. Bracken, she whispered. She almost never said the name outside. It felt like reaching, but the word slipped from her before caution could catch it. The yard gave no answer. The woodpile stood dark and empty. The lilac beuet hat held beads of ice along every twig. The mint pot had finally surrendered to the cold. Clara looked toward the fence line, then the blackberries, then the leaning post where Bracken had rubbed her cheek. Tracks crossed the frost there. Clara saw them from the porch and felt her stomach tighten. She went back inside for proper boots, moving too quickly and banging her shoulder against the doorframe. The chipped yellow mug sat unused on the counter. She left it there. Outside again. She took the steps one at a time, gripping the rail. The tracks were Bracken-esque, small, round, precise, without the clumsy nail marks a dog would leave. They moved along the garden fence, paused near the blackberries, circled the blue bowl once from a distance, then angled toward the pasture gate. Clara followed. The frost made every sound sharper. Her boots crushed grass with a brittle whisper. A crow called once from the walnut tree, then fell quiet. Beyond the pasture, Briar Ridge waited against a pale strip of sky. At the gate, the old latch hung open. Not wide, just enough. The ice that had silenced it had also kept it from catching properly. Bracken-esque prints passed beneath the lower rail, followed by rough scuffs Clara could not understand. They looked like haste or fear. Her hand closed around the latch until cold burned her palm. "Thomas," she breathed, not as a prayer exactly, but as the old habit of turning toward him when the world tilted. She stepped through the gate. The pasture sloped toward Miller Creek, a narrow run of water that cut through the lower field before turning into laurel and stone. In summer, Milo had built little dams there and declared himself mayor of a town populated by minnows. In winter, the creek became a gray ribbon, shallow but quick, its banks slick with mud and frost. Bracken-S tracks crossed the pasture in a wavering line. That was wrong. Bracken never wasted steps. She moved with a wild creature, S economy, each paw placed as if the ground had been measured ahead of time. But these prints veered once toward the old apple tree, doubled back, then cut hard toward the creek. Beside them were marks where leaves had been kicked up, where frost had been scraped bare, where something had stopped and spun. Clara's mouth went dry. At the creek crossing, the prints ended. Not faded. Ended. They stopped at the soft mud near the water. One clear paw print pressed deep beside a stone. Another smeared forward. After that, the bank was broken by a slide of mud, crushed grass, and a thin laurel branch snapped low across the path. Across the creek, Clara saw no tracks. Only wet stones, moving water, and the mouth of the woods beyond. She stood vacep te hot, both hands pressed against the top of her walking stick, though she did not remember bringing it. The creek made a small, cold sound around the rocks. A leaf, stiff with ice, spun in an eddy and disappeared under the bank. Bracken was not there. Clara looked upstream, downstream, toward the ridge, toward the pasture behind her, where the rocker sat empty under the porch roof. The chair moved again in the wind. Forward. Back. No shadow answered. For a moment, Clara felt anger so sharp it frightened her. Not at Bracken. Never at Bracken. At the gate latch she had not fixed. At her old hands. At Thomas for being gone and leaving his can of bent nails beneath the window. She bent slowly and touched the last paw print with 2 fingers. The mud was cold and soft. A sound came from the brush across the creek. Clara straightened. Nothing showed. Only laurel leaves trembling where no wind reached. "Bracken?" she whispered. A squirrel burst from the brush and raced up a hickory, chattering outrage at the morning. Clara exhaled a breath that hurt. By the time Milo arrived before school, Clara was still at the creek, coat damp at the hem, fingers red from cold. He came running across the pasture with his backpack bouncing. "Gran?" She turned, and the look on her face stopped him several yards away. He followed her gaze to the broken mud, the last print, the empty far bank. She followed something. "Didn't she?" he asked. Clara nodded. Behind them, the porch chair creaked in the wind again. Milo stepped closer and held out one mittened hand. Clara took it. His fingers were warm around hers, clumsy with worry. For once, neither of them made a joke about anything. The blue enamel bowl waited by the porch, steam long gone, its surface filmed with ice. And all morning, as the frost melted from the field, the space beside Clara's rocker remained empty. By noon, The whole house seemed to understand that Bracken was missing. The porch held itself too still. The rocker, when Clara touched it, gave only one tired creak and settled again, as if even the chair had no heart for pretending. The blue enamel bowl remained 3 feet from the door, a thin skin of melted frost trembling across its surface. Clara emptied it, washed it, filled it again, and set it back in the same place, though she knew Bracken was not there to drink. Some routines were not hope. Some were simply the only way a frightened heart knew how to keep its hands busy. Milo refused to go to school. Rachel argued for exactly 4 minutes, then looked at Clara's face and stopped. She called the attendance office from the kitchen, using her nurse's voice, the one that made people agree before they understood they had agreed. Then she filled a thermos with coffee, another with broth, and wrapped 3 biscuits in a towel. "You'll forget to eat," Rachel told her mother. "Mort have forgotten many things," Clara said quietly. "Eating is usually not one of them." Rachel's mouth tightened, but she put the biscuits in Clara's coat pocket anyway. Milo gathered things as if preparing for an expedition across Alaska instead of a search along Briar Ridge. He packed a flashlight, 2 granola bars, a pencil, his old field guide, a roll of orange twine, and 1 clean sock whose purpose he could not explain. When Clara saw it sticking from the backpack, she only raised an eyebrow. "For emergencies," he said. "What kind?" "Look know when it happens." For a moment, Clara almost smiled. Then the porch boards looked empty again, and the smile faded before it fully arrived. Dr. Lila Marsh came just after 1, driving her mud-splashed county truck with a wildlife carrier strapped in the back, though everyone understood they might not need it, or might need it in a way no one wanted to say. With her came Officer Owen Bell, a broad-shouldered wildlife officer in his 50s, who moved with the patient heaviness of someone used to waiting for animals, weather, and people to reveal themselves. He crouched by the creek crossing without touching the mud. "Bobcat," he said, studying the last print. "Young female. Same one you described." Clara stood beside him, with her hands folded around Thomas's walking stick. The creek smelled of stone, cold leaves, and the dark mineral scent of stirred mud. Water slipped under the broken laurel branch with a hush that seemed too gentle for the worry it carried. "She was moving fast," Lila said. Owen nodded. Something startled her, or drew her. Milo's eyes went to the far bank. Could she have jumped? "She could," Owen said, "but she may have landed on rock. Frost makes bad footing." Rachel put one arm around Milo's shoulders. He did not shrug her off. They crossed farther upstream, where flat stones made a safer path. Clara hated needing help, but accepted Rachel's hand without protest. Pride had no use in a search. On the far bank, Owen found what Clara had not been able to see from across the creek. A faint scrape in the moss, 2 disturbed leaves, and a single pale hair caught on the rough bark of a laurel stem. Lila lifted it carefully. Clara knew that color. Smoke and fallen leaves. Her throat closed. They searched until afternoon thinned into evening. Owen moved slowly, reading the ground the way Clara had once read library cards. Here, a paw had slid in damp soil. There, leaves had been pressed by a low body. Near a tangle of greenbrier, they found a small place where bracken seemed to have crouched, hidden and listening. The grass was flattened in an oval. A few drops of melted frost clung to the blades. "She stopped here," Owen said. Clara looked at the hollow and saw bracken under the glider, chin on her paws, torn ear twitching to the rocker-s creak. The memory hurt so sharply she had to turn away. Milo noticed. He stepped beside her and opened the towel around the biscuits. "Gran," he said, "Rachel will fuss if you don tea." Clara took one because he needed her to. The biscuit tasted like flour and worry. Halfway through, a chickadee landed on a branch above them and scolded everyone with bright, furious importance. Milo whispered, "She's organizing the search party." Even Rachel laughed once, small and helpless. They followed the ridge trail past the old apple tree, through laurel thick enough to scrape sleeves, and up toward a shelf of stone where foxes sometimes denned. Owen showed Milo how to look without trampling signs. Lila called softly now and then, not Bracken's name, but low soothing sounds meant less to summon than to announce that humans were near and trying not to be dangerous. Clara did not call. She was afraid Bracken would hear her and try to come when she should stay hidden. She was more afraid Bracken would not hear at all. Dusk came early under the ridge. The sky between branches turned pewter. Rachel switched on a lantern, and its yellow circle trembled over wet bark and brown leaves. Another lantern swung from Owen's hand. The two lights moved through the trees like small moons, unable to find what they loved. At one point, Milo slipped on a patch of mud and sat down hard. The mysterious emergency sock fell from his backpack and landed on a root. Clara looked at it. Milo looked at it. Rachel said, "At last, its moment has come." Milo, muddy and miserable, laughed despite himself, and Clara loved him so fiercely in that second that it frightened her. This was what searching did. It made every small living sound precious. Every joke became a match struck in a cold room. But the ridge gave them no bobcat. Only an old scent mark on a fallen log. Only scratches where claws had tested bark. Only one partial print near a cluster of stones, already softening at the edges as the damp air took it back. By full dark, Owen stopped at the top of the pasture trail. His face was kind, which Clara did not want. "She knows this land better than we do," he said. "If she can hide, she will. We should come back at first light." Clara looked into the black trees. The words made sense. They did not help. Back at the house, Rachel warmed soup. Milo sat on the porch step with his muddy knees drawn up, staring toward the creek. Clara stood by the rocker and laid one hand on its worn wooden arm. She moved it once. Forward. Back. The creek went out into the cold yard, crossed the empty bowl, touched the hydrangeas, and disappeared among the trees. No torn ear rose from the shadows. No golden eyes opened. Clara stayed there until Rachel came and wrapped Thomas's flannel tighter around her shoulders. Only then did she let herself be led inside, leaving the porch light burning for a wild little shadow who had not yet found her way home. The next day moved as if it had been wrapped in wool. Sounds came muffled. The kettle's whistle seemed far away. Rachel's voice on the phone blurred at the edges when she called the hospital to say she would not be in for the morning shift. Milo sat at the kitchen table with his field guide open, but he did not turn the pages. Clara stood at the sink, washing the chipped yellow mug twice because she could not remember washing it the first time. Outside, frost melted from the pasture and left the grass dark and bent. Owen Bell returned at first light, and Lila came soon after, with mud already on her boots. They searched again along Miller Creek, farther downstream this time, where the bank narrowed beneath laurel roots and the water slipped under a shelf of stone. Clara went with them until Rachel touched her elbow and said, very gently, that her lips had gone blue from cold. Clara wanted to argue. Then her knee buckled on a wet root, and Milo caught her arm before she fell. Mort meant fine, she said, because old pride sometimes spoke before truth could get its shoes on. You are not fine in a very convincing way, Milo answered. Even Owen smiled at that, briefly and kindly. By afternoon, they had found no fresh tracks, only the softened memory of yesterday's trail and a tuft of rabbit fur snagged on a briar. Bracken's absence seemed to grow roots in every place they looked. It lived under the woodpile. It lay beneath the glider. It hovered beside the blue enamel bowl, which Clara had filled again, though the water had gone untouched. Near dusk, Owen told them what he had told them before, only softer. She may be tucked somewhere we can TC. She may move after dark. Clara nodded because nodding was easier than speaking. When the trucks finally left, Rachel stayed. She heated broth and made Clara drink it from Thomas' old camping cup. Milo shook out the blue blanket and spread it over Clara's knees as if she were the one recovering from some wild country hurt. He tucked one corner too high, nearly under her chin, and she gave him a look. "What?" he said. "You re-portable soup now." Rachel laughed into her sleeve. Clara made a sound that almost became laughter too. It did not last, but helped. The evening settled cold and violet over Briar Ridge. Fog began climbing from the creek. The porch light clicked on, filling the boards with a soft amber glow and making the empty geranium pot cast a crooked shadow against the steps. Clara sat in the rocker because she could not bear not sitting there. Rachel took the chair near the door. Milo sat on the top step, wrapped in a quilt, his sneakers planted carefully away from the blue bowl. No one said much. The woods, however, spoke in all their small ways. A barred owl called from the lower hollow. Dry leaves whispered against the fence. Somewhere near the apple tree, a branch gave a small brittle snap. Milo lifted his head. Rachel's hand tightened around her cup. Clara stopped rocking. The silence after the snap seemed to lean toward the porch. Then, from the dark beyond the hydrangeas, came a sound too small to be called a cry. It was a rough breath, a scrape, a living thing trying not to be heard and failing because it was tired. Clara's fingers closed around the rocker arm. "Don't move," Lila would have said. So Clara did not move. The hydrangea stems trembled. A shape gathered behind them, low and uneven, as if the shadows themselves were limping. One torn ear appeared first beneath the porch light. Then a narrow face, muddied along one cheek. Then Bracken stepped into view. Milo covered his mouth, vekepitahat both hands. Rachel whispered, something that might have been a prayer. Bracken looked smaller than she had 2 days ago. Mud streaked her legs. Damp leaves clung to her side. She held herself carefully, favoring one hind foot, and her golden eyes were half closed with exhaustion. But they were still hers, watchful, proud, unwilling to surrender even to the people who had been waiting. Clara did not say her name. The bobcat stared at the porch. Her nostrils trembled. She sniffed once toward the blue enamel bowl, once toward Milo, once toward Rachel's soup cup. Then her torn ear twitched. Clara understood before she moved. Slowly, so slowly the rocker barely spoke, she set her feet against the boards and pushed. Forward. The chair creaked. Bracken's head lifted. Back. The chair sighed. Bracken took one step. Milo's eyes filled, but he made no sound. Rachel pressed one hand over her own heart, and with the other, she reached behind her to steady Milo's shoulder. Clara rocked again. Forward. Back. Bracken crossed the yard in small, uneven movements, pausing after every few steps to listen toward the ridge. Twice she turned as if the woods had called her back. Twice the rocker creaked, and she faced the porch again. When she reached the bottom step, she did not climb under the glider. She came to the side of the rocker, closer than she had ever come. Clara felt the warmth of the animal before she felt anything else, a thin living heat rising through cold air. Bracken's whiskers trembled near the runner. Her bent whisker brushed the wood. Then, with a trembling care that seemed to use the last of her strength, she pressed her muddy cheek against the curved rocker base. Not Clara's hand. Not the blanket. The chair. The sound that had led her home. Clara looked down at the torn ear, at the leaves caught in Bracken's coat, at the stubborn little creature who had remained wild even in returning. Tears blurred the porch light, but she let them fall silently. She had learned enough by then not to crowd a miracle with human hands. Milo sniffed once and immediately pretended it was the cold. Rachel, who saw everything, handed him a napkin without looking at him. Bracken stayed against the rocker for 3 breaths. Then she sank beneath the edge of the chair, not touching Clara, but close enough that Clara could feel each shallow breath against her slipper. The blue bowl waited beside them. The fog folded around the porch, and Clara, rocking no more, sat perfectly still while her lost shadow rested at her feet. Bracken did not let anyone help her quickly. That was the first lesson of her return. She lay beneath the rocker until the porch boards grew damp with fog, and the cold crept through Clara's slippers. Her breathing stayed shallow but even. Every few minutes her torn left ear twitched toward the ridge, toward Rachel, shifting feet, toward Milo's careful sniffle, toward the smallest scrape of Clara's chair. She seemed held between 2 worlds, the dark trees that had nearly kept her and the porch that had kept moving in her memory. Clara wanted to gather her up. The want came so strongly that it frightened her. It rose in her hands, in her knees, in the old empty place beside her ribs. She wanted to wrap Bracken in the blue blanket, carry her inside, set her by the stove, and tell the whole wild world it had taken enough. But Bracken was not a child. She was not a house cat. She was not Grief's answer wrapped in spotted fur. So Clara kept her hands on the rocker arms and whispered, "Easy." Not to Bracken alone. To herself. Rachel called Dr. Lila Marsh from the kitchen while watching through the screen door. Lila arrived in 20 minutes with a soft carrier, thick gloves, and the kind of patience that did not announce itself. Owen Bell came behind her, quieter than his truck should have allowed, leaving the headlights angled toward the pasture instead of the porch. No one rushed up the steps. Lila crouched near the hydrangeas, far enough away that Bracken could see her without feeling trapped. She spoke in a low voice, less like speaking to an animal than like smoothing wrinkles from the air. "She made it home," Lila said softly. Clara nodded once. Bracken lifted her head. Her eyes flashed. For a moment, the exhausted creature under the chair vanished, and the ridge cat returned, proud and dangerous in a body too tired to back up its warning. She pulled her sore hind foot closer, hiding it beneath her. Milo whispered from behind Rachel, "She is pretending she is fine." Clara gave a small, watery breath that might have been laughter. Runs in this family. Rachel looked at her mother. It certainly does. Even Lila smiled, but she did not move closer. They waited until Bracken chose her next in. It took nearly half an hour. The wind pushed dry leaves against the steps. The blue enamel bowl clicked faintly when a leaf touched its rim. Somewhere beyond the creek, the owl called again, and Bracken answered with a weak lift of her chin. At last, thirst made the decision. She stretched her neck toward the water, but could not quite reach. Clara looked at Lila. Lila nodded. Slowly, Clara slid one epaulet forward and nudged the blue bowl with the edge of her slipper. Not close enough to touch Bracken. Just close enough for the water to tremble within reach. Bracken froze at the motion. Pupils wide, then lowered her head and drank. 3 laps. A pause. 2 more. The same old pattern. Milo pressed his sleeve against his eyes and pretended to study the porch roof. When Bracken finished, she turned her face toward the rocker base and rested her bent whisker against it, as if keeping one small point of contact with the thing she trusted most. Then she allowed her eyes to close. Only then did Lila come nearer. The examination was not dramatic. It was careful, slow, and full of stopping. Bracken hissed once, a dry little scrape that made Milo step backward into Rachel's foot. Owen stood at the bottom of the stairs, broad and still, holding the carrier with its door open, and a towel warmed from Lila's truck heater tucked inside. "She's favoring the foot," Lila murmured. "Cold, tired, scratched up. But Mort don't think anything is broken." Clara closed her eyes. The relief did not feel light. It felt heavy, as if it had been waiting on her chest and had only now remembered to move. They did not bring Bracken into the house. Lila explained it gently before anyone asked. A warm kitchen, strange walls, human scent everywhere, Rachel's perfume, Milo's nervous breathing, the stove ticking and pipes knocking, all of it could panic a wild animal already pushed past her strength. Instead, they made the porch safer. Owen blocked the open side below the steps with a loose windbreak of boards and old feed sacks, leaving a clear path out toward the yard, because Lila insisted Bracken Mauete never feel trapped. Rachel brought the old wool rug Clara kept for winter boots. Milo, after much solemn thought, offered the emergency sock. "What is it for?" Rachel asked. "Emotional infrastructure," he said. Clara laughed then. It came out cracked and small, but it was laughter. Milo placed the clean sock near the carrier, not near Bracken, and everyone pretended this was a medically recognized contribution. Lila cleaned what she could without forcing more than Bracken could bear. She left instructions in a calm voice: water, distance, quiet, watch the foot, call if her breathing changed, no crowding, no touching unless absolutely necessary. Clara listened as if receiving a fragile recipe. By midnight, Rachel had gone inside to warm broth. Milo had fallen asleep, sitting against the kitchen door with his mouth open, and Owen had driven away with a promise to check the ridge at dawn. Lila remained until Bracken shifted herself from beneath the rocker to the shadow under the glider, where the borrowed plaid slipper still lived in household legend. Bracken tucked her nose near the rug, but not on it. She placed one paw on Milo's emergency sock. No one mentioned it until morning. Clara sat in the rocker with the blue blanket around her shoulders and did not rock. The chair stayed still because Bracken slept beside its shadow, and Clara had finally understood that comfort was not always motion. Sometimes love meant becoming the quietest thing in the room. The hearth inside glowed through the screen door, orange and low. It warmed the glass but not the porch. Still, Clara felt its light on her back while the cold touched her face. Between those two temperatures, she kept watch. Near dawn, Bracken stirred. Her torn ear twitched. Her eyes opened to narrow gold slits. She looked first toward the ridge, then toward Clara's still hands. Clara whispered, "Mort met here." Bracken closed her eyes again. And, for that hour, it was enough. Winter did not end all at once in Clara Whitcomb S. Hollow. It loosened by inches. First the ice left the pasture trough. Then the frost stopped whitening the porch rail. The creek grew fuller over the stones. Green pushed through the dead mint in the cracked pot. By March, the air smelled of thawed mud, wood smoke, and the first shy sweetness of daffodils along the fence where Thomas had planted bulbs badly, some like confused little lanterns. Bracken healed the same way. Not in a miracle. In inches. For days after her return, she favored her hind foot and kept to the porch shadows, leaving only at night and coming back before Clara's first tea. Then the limp softened. The mud dried from her coat. Her eyes grew sharper. She began grooming with her old brisk seriousness, pausing between strokes to glare at the blue enamel bowl, as if it had witnessed too much. By early spring, she no longer slept beneath the glider every afternoon. She vanished for longer hours into Briar Ridge. Sometimes Clara saw her at motif dusk along the fence line, moving with that low certainty that belonged to no porch and no person. Sometimes the rocker creaked and no torn ear appeared. Clara told herself that was good. Some days she nearly believed it. Love had grown more disciplined over the winter. She had learned to leave the bowl out without waiting beside it. She had learned to sit through evenings when the chair rocked alone. She had learned that missing a wild creature did not mean the wild creature had done wrong. Still, when Bracken came back and followed the rocker for a few steps, Clara felt the house breathe. One April morning, Milo arrived with strawberry plants and a haircut Rachel had clearly supervised against his will. He stood on the porch while Clara inspected him. "You look respectable," she said. "What can ove kep?" he answered mournfully. "It's been difficult." Bracken, hidden under the lilac, sneezed once. Milo pointed gently. "Even she agrees." Clara laughed and set him to work near the back fence, far from Bracken's usual paths. The morning warmed. Bees trembled over the dandelions. A robin dragged a worm from the earth with the grim focus of a farmer pulling fence wire. Clara sat in the rocker shelling peas into a tin bowl, the green drops pattering like rain remembered. Bracken appeared near the blackberries just before noon. She did not come alone. At first, when Clara thought the moving specks behind her were leaves blown low over the grass. Then one tumbled sideways, righted itself, and revealed a round, spotted face too small for the seriousness it tried to wear. Milo froze with both hands in the dirt. "Gran," he breathed. Clara's fingers stopped over the pea bowl. Two kittens stood in the shadow of the garden fence. They were bobcat kittens, small and sturdy, their coats marked ve kepte, hats, soft spots and stripes that made them disappear whenever they stepped into broken sunlight. One had a pale chin and ears too large for its head. The other was darker, with a tiny black smudge beside its nose, and a tail that twitched as if it were making decisions, independent of the rest of the body. Bracken stood between them and the porch. Not relaxed. Not showing them off. Her body was alert, one shoulder slightly lowered, torn left ear swiveling from Clara to Milo to the ridge and back again. She had brought them only to the edge, only as far as trust allowed, and every line of her said the gift could be taken back in an instant. Clara did not speak. Milo did not breathe loudly. One kitten, the pale-chinned one, took 3 bold steps and pounced on a fallen pea pod. The pod did not fight back. The kitten wrestled it anyway, rolling once into the grass before springing up ve kep ite hot great dignity. Milo's eyes shone. The darker kitten sniffed the blue enamel bowl from a distance, flinched at its own reflection, and retreated behind Bracken's back leg. Bracken looked down at it, then away, as if embarrassed by the youth of her household. Clara felt something inside her open so tenderly it almost hurt. This was why, she thought. Not all of why, perhaps. Wild lives did not arrange themselves neatly for human understanding, but the pacing, the ridgeward stare, the disappearance, the long recovery, the new caution in Bracken's movements, all of it gathered into the sight of those 2 small bodies at the fence. Bracken had not left Clara's porch because she loved it less. She had left because life had called her to become more than Clara's shadow. Rachel came by an hour later and found 3 humans standing at mote-feet careful distances from the garden as if attending a church service. Clara sat with the pea bowl forgotten in her lap. Milo crouched near the strawberry plants, mud on both knees. Mr. Alvarez, delivering a seed catalog, stood at the gate holding the mail against his chest. "What is happening?" Rachel whispered. Milo pointed without looking away. One kitten had climbed halfway into the cracked mint pot and seemed deeply surprised that plants occupied it. The other batted at Thomas' old boot scraper, lost, recovered, and batted at it again with greater suspicion. Bracken watched with an expression Clara recognized from mothers in the library, whose toddlers had discovered the lower shelves. Rachel's hand went to her mouth. Oh. The word held her fear and softness. Bracken heard it. Her head turned. For one breath, everyone stilled. Then the pale-chinned kitten sneezed into the mint. Clara made the mistake of smiling too visibly. Bracken gathered herself at once. With one low chuff, barely more than air, she called the kittens back. They obeyed badly, but eventually, one tripping over a strawberry marker, the other trying to carry the pea pod and failing. Bracken led them through the blackberries and into the lower brush, stopping once to look back at the porch. Clara's rocker had not moved. Slowly, she set one epaote down and pushed. Forward. Back. The chair gave its soft old creak. Bracken's torn ear lifted. The kittens vanished into the green behind her, but Bracken remained for one more breath, golden eyes on Clara, wild and impossible to own. Then she followed her young into Briar Ridge. The porch stayed quiet after that, but not empty. It held the pea bowl, the blue water, Milo's muddy laugh, Rachel's hand on Clara's shoulder, and the sudden knowledge that the shadow had become a mother. By early May, the porch learned new footsteps. They were not steady footsteps, not yet. They came in rushes and skids, in sudden sideways springs that made the mint tremble and the hydrangea stems shiver. They came with tiny claws clicking once or twice on the lowest step before their owners remembered they were supposed to be invisible. They came under Bracken's watchful golden eyes and vanished the instant a truck passed on the road. Clara never called the kittens closer. Milo named them only for conversation, not for claiming. The pale-chinned one became Button because he kept appearing where no sensible creature could fit, under the feed sack, behind the water bucket, once halfway inside Milo's empty backpack with only his spotted hindquarters showing. The darker one became Thistle because she seemed to object to everything first and investigate it second. Rachel said naming them was a terrible idea. Then she brought a pair of binoculars and whispered, "Thistle is climbing the beanpole." Clara looked over her glasses. A terrible idea. Was it? Rachel did not answer because Thistle had reached the top of the short pole, discovered height, and immediately looked personally betrayed by it. Bracken watched from the fence line, her torn left ear angled toward the porch. She did not rush to rescue the kitten. She simply waited, body still, tail tip moving once. After a moment, Thistle found her way down, the Kepite hat much unnecessary drama, and a final leap into the marigolds. Button pounced on her, as if he had engineered the whole event. Milo folded Beote hot hands over his mouth to keep from laughing too loudly. The garden had become a place of careful arrangements. Clara moved the blue enamel bowl farther from the porch and closer to the blackberry canes, not to invite dependence, but to keep the young ones from climbing too near the house. Lila approved, after reminding everyone that the family must not feed, touch, or tame them. Water during dry spells was one thing. Turning wild babies into porch ornaments was another. Clara understood. She had understood more deeply the Kepite hot every week that passed. Bracken still came at dusk, but not always alone and not always close. Some evenings she crossed the lower garden with the kittens behind her, teaching them the borders of scent and sound. She rubbed her cheek against the leaning fence post, then watched as Button tried to do the same and missed the post entirely, rubbing his chin on empty air. Thistle sniffed the blue bowl, dipped one paw in, and shook droplets onto Button's face. Button looked stunned. Clara murmured, "That one has Rachel's sense of justice." Rachel, standing behind the screen door, said, "Maud heard that. You were meant to." There were new rules now. No porch visits when Bracken brought the kittens near. No Milo in the grass unless Clara or Rachel was with him. No sudden opening of the kitchen door. Mr. Alvarez left the mail at the gate and saluted the hydrangeas, as if reporting to a small forest militia. He once delivered a package by setting it on the fence rail and backing away with both hands raised. "Your security has expanded," he told Clara later. "She has apprentices," Clara said. The air turned soft and green, the pasture filled with clover. In the evenings, the creek carried the smell of whetstone and fern, and fireflies began stitching tiny lights above the ditch. Clara sat in the rocker with the lavender quilt nearly finished across her lap. The old stolen slipper had long since been returned, though Bracken occasionally sniffed it as she passed, perhaps checking that her previous legal claim remained respected. Clara's heart had changed its shape around this new season. She still missed Thomas. She missed him when the gate latch tapped, when the bean rows needed tying, when Milo laughed, "Ve kepi, te" at his head, thrown back exactly the way Thomas used to laugh at thunder. But the grief no longer filled every chair. Sometimes it sat beside her quietly while she watched Bracken teach her young to vanish. That lesson hurt, and it healed. One evening, Button crept close enough to inspect the lowest porch step. He placed Beote hat front paws on the board, sniffed the old stain shaped like a fish, and sneezed. Thistle, not to be outdone, darted past him and batted at a fallen thread from Clara's quilt basket. The thread stuck briefly to her whiskers. She crossed her eyes trying to understand it. Milo made a sound like a kettle being sat on. Bracken stepped from the shadows. Instantly, both kittens froze. The mother bobcat did not growl. She did not swat. She gave one low chuff, softer than a cough, and turned toward the blackberries. Button obeyed, bouncing once over the mint pot. Thistle hesitated only long enough to glare at the thread, then followed. But Bracken did not leave at once. She remained near the bottom step while Clara's rocker moved. Forward. Back. Forward. For the first time in many evenings, Bracken followed the chair without looking toward the kittens. 3 steps forward as Clara rocked. 1 pause. 3 steps back. The torn ear twitched with the creak, and her cheek fur caught the porch light in a silver edge. Clara did not mistake it for old times. Old times never returned exactly. They became soil under new ones. Still, her throat tightened. "You re a good mother," Rachel whispered from the doorway. Bracken looked at her, sneezed once at the familiar perfume, and sat down. Rachel pressed her lips together. Progress. Clara smiled. The kittens rustled in the blackberries. The porch boards cooled under the falling dark. Milo leaned against the rail, long-legged and quiet, no longer quite the child who had once read field guides to the afternoon. Clara felt time moving around all of them. Boy growing, daughter softening, wild kitten strengthening, bobcat mother standing between porch light and ridge shadow. At last, Bracken turned to leave. She paused beside the blue bowl, drank 3 quick laps, then 2 more, and stepped into the grass. The kittens joined her at the garden fence, small bodies flickering through clover. Together they crossed toward Briar Ridge, not as visitors retreating, but as a family going where they belonged. Clara rocked until they disappeared. This time, the empty space beside the chair did not feel abandoned. It felt trusted. Years later, Clara Whitcomb would still hear the rocker before she heard anything else. It had become the old porch heartbeat, a soft forward and back sound that carried through summer rain, winter fog, and the bright, fragile mornings of spring. The cushion had faded almost white. The arm on the right side had worn smooth beneath Clara's hand. Milo had tightened the loose runner twice, and then stopped because Clara said it no longer sounded right when it behaved too well. The porch had changed around it. The mint pot had cracked clear down one side and been wrapped with copper wire by Rachel, who insisted that even stubborn plants deserved medical intervention. The empty geranium pot finally held geraniums again, red as little porch lanterns. The blue enamel bowl, chipped rim and all, rested near the blackberry canes during dry spells. Though not every day, Clara had learned to offer help without building a chain from it. Briar Ridge remained itself. It greened, darkened, shed leaves, froze, thawed, and greened again. The creek shifted stones after storms. The old apple tree lost one heavy branch and kept blooming anyway. The loose gate latch, after years of tapping, was finally repaired by Milo one summer afternoon when he was home from college and tired of hearing Clara threaten to fix it herself. "It's historic," she had told him. "It's a hazard," he had answered. Thomas would have laughed. Milo was taller than the porch beam now, though Clara still saw the boy who once brought an emergency sock into a wildlife search. He studied wildlife biology at the university, 2 counties over, and came home with mud on his boots, notebooks full of tracks, and a careful way of speaking about animals that made Clara proud without needing to say so. He still sat in the grass sometimes, though his knees folded less easily than before. Rachel had softened too. She still worried. That was her nature and her profession both. But she no longer looked at the woods as if they had personally insulted her mother. On warm evenings, she stood behind the screen door with tea, watching shadows gather near the fence. Bracken became less frequent as the years moved. That was right. Her kittens grew into the ridge and took its secrets with them. Button was seen once at the far creek bend, larger and bold, vanishing beneath Laurel after knocking a beetle from a stump with unnecessary confidence. Thistle left only stories. A dark young bobcat caught by Owen Bell's trail camera near Miller Creek, glaring at the lens as if it had trespassed. Bracken herself remained Bracken. Older, heavier through the shoulders, still marked by the torn left ear and the bent whisker that had never straightened. The pale scratch below her brow faded until it showed only in angled light. She no longer came to the porch every dusk. Sometimes weeks passed with no sign except one clean print near the water bowl or a faint cheek rub on the leaning fence post. Clara missed her. But missing had changed. It no longer asked to be fed every hour. It came like evening fog, quiet and familiar, and sat down beside all the other things Clara had loved without owning. Thomas, Milo's childhood. Rachel's young face before worry drew its fine lines. A wild bobcat who had once pressed her muddy cheek to a rocking chair because sound had carried her home. On Clara's 80th birthday, the family gathered on the porch after supper. Rachel brought lemon cake. Milo brought field flowers from the lower meadow, tied with twine. Mr. Alvarez, retired but still loyal to porch diplomacy, appeared with pear preserves and claimed he had only come to inspect the security situation. Clara wore Thomas's flannel, though the evening was warm. The sun dropped behind Briar Ridge, turning the pasture gold at the edges. Fireflies lifted from the ditch. Someone had moved the blue bowl near the blackberries because June had been dry, and it caught the last light in its chipped rim. Clara sat in the rocker. Forward. Back. The chair creaked into the soft evening. Milo stopped speaking first. Rachel followed his gaze. At the edge of the garden, where the blackberries tangled over the fence, Bracken stood half in shadow. She was older now. Clara could see it in the careful placement of her paws, in the slight delay before she lifted her head. But her eyes were clear. Her torn ear rose into the amber light. No one moved. Bracken looked at the porch, at the people, at the cake on the little table, at Mr. Alvarez holding his paper plate as if it might be confiscated. Then she looked at Clara. Clara did not call her. She only rocked. Forward. Back. Bracken stepped once. Forward. Back. She stepped again, slow and silent, through the clover. Not close to the crowd. Not tame. Never that. She came only as far as the old hydrangeas, now green and full, and sat where she had crouched on that first foggy evening years before. Milo's eyes shone, but he smiled this time. Rachel whispered. She remembered. Clara kept her hand on the rocker arm. No, she said softly. She never forgot. The bobcat watched the chair move, and for a few minutes the porch became every season at Moat Fee once. The frost at the creek, the emergency sock, the stolen slipper, the kittens in the mint, the long nights of waiting, the first careful drink from the blue bowl. All of it gathered there without crowding the silence. Then Bracken rose. She turned toward the ridge, paused, and looked back one last time. The torn ear twitched at the creak of the chair. Clara rocked once more. It was enough. Bracken slipped into the blackberries, into the clover, into the dark green breath of Briar Ridge. And Clara stayed on the porch with her family around her, her old chair moving gently beneath her, knowing that some shadows did not need to remain beside a person to prove they had belonged. The night deepened slowly after that, the way kind endings often did. No one hurried inside. Rachel cut the last thin slice of lemon cake and wrapped it for Milo, though he said he was too full and took it anyway. Mr. Alvarez carried his empty plate to the kitchen, like a man returning borrowed treasure. The fireflies rose higher, blinking above the pasture, as if the earth had lifted a handful of stars and let them drift. Clara kept rocking. The blue enamel bowl held a small moon. The repaired gate latch stayed silent in the distance, and somehow that silence no longer felt like loss. The mint breathed from its wired pot. The lavender quilt rested over Clara's knees, finished long ago but still warm vacape ite hot every evening it had witnessed. Out beyond the blackberries, Bracken moved where human eyes could not follow. Perhaps she paused near the creek. Perhaps she climbed the ridge path with the careful strength of an older wild thing that still cano ave kept every hidden trail. Perhaps her grown young crossed her scent in the dark and understood, in whatever way the wild understands, that she had once kept a strange friendship with a porch, a chair, and an old woman who never asked too much. For those who stayed with Clara this far, the house seemed to offer its own quiet thanks. Thank you for sitting beside the rocker. Thank you for listening to the soft spaces between fear and trust. Somewhere, maybe, there was an animal that had changed your life too, not by staying forever, but by arriving exactly when your heart needed a shadow beside it. The porch light glowed. The chair creaked once more. Forward. Back. Then the ridge gathered the sound into its leaves, and the night settled gently over them all. End of story. Sleep gently, friends.